Welcome to Air Checks. Here is more of the Gene Shepherd Marathon on WOR in New York City. From February 15, 1962, the human race is. First days are very important. The first day at the steel mill, a job gotten through a ham radio contact. Life isn't exactly the way it seems to be. Great Shepherd.
And, where's the Gene Shepherd tape? Not in the machine. Here it is. Okay, Gene Shepherd from 1962. These are shows that I was given on the promise that I would not sell, barter, or in any way hand them off to people, but broadcasting was permitted from this fellow out in Washington, so let's broadcast them and get them out there somehow to hear. From February the 15th, 1962, complete with the jumble of news and strangeness at the beginning. Well, here's Gene.
The situation could develop into another Korea. Mr. Kennedy confirmed an earlier statement by British leader Macmillan that there will be no nuclear testing on Christmas Isle in the Pacific, at least until the opening of the Geneva Conference next week.
Yeah, I'm constantly being torn between those terrible poles. It's like, it's like an attempt to see through something that is unseeable throughable. You know, it's like you're swimming in a 4,000-foot deep sea of Lipton's pea soup, and you keep getting hit by onions. Bouncing around there, once in a while, a little piece of chicory comes past, and occasionally a little itsy-bitsy piece of maybe carrot. I mean, to give it a little pizzazz. Get a little boop there. You know, speaking of the little boop there, very difficult to know which pathway you're taking. Now, before we go any further, I suppose, feel duty-bound to say that the following program does not represent the viewpoint of Lester Smith, or John A. Gambling, or John B. Gambling, or John L. Gambling, or John D. Gambling IV, who will be on next year. It doesn't represent anybody's viewpoint, actually, except my own. And I feel duty-bound also to say this, in all fairness, that if you're not interested in a personal viewpoint, you better leave. I don't want any unpleasantness here. Unpleasantness. Yet, on the other hand, what would we do without unpleasantness? Seriously. If life were what you think it should be, how would it be? I mean, do you really want it that way, actually? Oh, boy, be careful. Because I suspect that there maybe are three ways that we live. One way, people take three different routes. There are three different ways to exist. And the most common way is to exist by the myth. Now, myths have nothing to do with Greek myths. The myth that could be called basic folk knowledge. Like, for example, there is a myth that says, evil will be uncovered eventually. Well, people live by this. Or they say, there are millions of myths of that type that say, I'm not very wealthy, but the people who are wealthy are happy. Happier than I am. Or, and you can take the other side, I am happy, but the wealthy people aren't, so I'm happy not being wealthy. Millions of myths, all kinds of myths. A man will work in an organization like where they sell sweet potatoes, and he believes, because he has to, because it's a myth, and a myth is what he lives by, that sweet potatoes are important. He has to believe it. If he didn't, somehow his life would suddenly collapse. He also has to believe that he is connected with an organization that turns out better sweet potatoes than anybody. He has to believe it. And then, on the other hand, he has to believe a lot of things. For example, and one of the great myths, of course, is the myth of love, which is a real troublesome one. And it's like trying to find, who was it? It was Diogenes that was looking for an honest man. I would say that Diogenes would have more success finding an honest man than he would have finding a happy man. A happy person. A truly happy person. Well, now, do you know anyone who is happy? Oh, already I can just see all the clean-limbed young ladies running for the phone to call up and say they're happy in these shrill, angry voices. Tell that man I'm happy! Wow, down it goes. Now, the other way you can choose to live, or it's not really a choice. You just pick it up, you just sort of do it. The other way you can choose to live is by the absurd. Now, people who are bugged by the absurd, who are in a sense conscious of the absurdities in life, generally, because they are not capable of anything else, retreat from them. And so these are the people you will see who will bury themselves in the file department at BBD&O, or let's say the file department at even let's say the Widget Bolt and Nut Company. And they cut out from their ken everything else that has to do with anything remotely connected with the outside world. You will never hear these people talk about Khrushchev. You will never hear these people talk about moonshots. You will never hear these people talk about how deep is the ocean. You will never hear these people ever once discuss a tornado that roared across Iowa. These people look at television and sleep. They have rejected life because of the absurdity or the impenetrability of it. And yet, they rarely are aware that they have. And so they will write you little letters that will say, and it was wonderful to get that type, they'll say, well, Mr. Shepherd, in these days, who wants gloomy things? Well, gloomy things mean truthful things. What is a gloomy thing is a truthful thing. What is a gloomy thing? I was trying, it's fascinating. I read, I don't know whether you're interested in this wild little psychological surmise that was made recently by a very interesting psychological researcher. And this is not an American type who is more interested in selling Wrigley gum and Dad's old-fashioned root beer. This is a man who is interested in what is happening. Why are we the way we are? His whole thesis was based on the fact that before every major war, there is a major and an all-encompassing dance fad that cuts through all levels of society. By the way, has it ever occurred to you that most of these people who are digging the twist have absolutely no realization of the fact that what they're doing is rock and roll, and pure rock and roll? I wonder if they know that. I wonder if Pegeen Fitzgerald knows that she's a rock and roller. She's in the twister. She's a rock and roller. Remember, the name means nothing. And the other day I heard John or somebody giving one of these polite little announcements of coming attractions that are going on in all these little neighborhood events, and he was saying the ladies of the Presbyterian Bake a Pie a Week Club are meeting in the church basement next Monday night for a twist party. The admission is free. There will be a collection taken for the Abyssinian Library Fund. Now remember, next Sunday, or no, it's a Monday night, the ladies of the Bake a Pie a Week Club of the Presbyterian Church will have their twist party. I wonder if those chicks know they're digging rock and roll. See, it's a matter of semantics. It's interesting how we tag things. That I imagine in that very same pulpit, the minister has inveighed against rock and roll. Yes. That you can't accept that term. Well, this is part of the myth. You see where the mythical angle comes in. Now, the people who are hung up with the absurd. Now, the absurd, of course, is a difficult position to be in, to understand or to feel or to know about the absurd. A very difficult problem there. Now, then there's a third way. And this way of existence is the least followed and the most difficult of all to understand. And that is the following of a logical path, which, going back to the original Latin derivation of logic, has to do with developing a structure, literally developing a structure that is based on a few recognizable and established premises, like I am here. This is a recognizable and almost established premise. and oh yes, one philosopher said that when anybody ever attempts to talk about the mythos, the myth, by which a large percentage of the population exists, he will almost invariably be called a double talker, a kook, a crank, and possibly even insane, and certainly dangerous. Well, now the last one is true. Because once the myths come tumbling down, be careful. Then you have to start a whole new situation. And so, speaking about myths, there's a myth. One of the most probably prevalent myths is that people love the sea. People say they love it. In fact, I'll bet I can get 2,500 calls in the next 5 minutes if I say everybody who's listening who loves the sea, call me. Well, I remember a magnificent essay on that subject. I think, yes, it was in Moby Dick. Melville was talking about the actual fact that men not only do not love the sea, but the sea is one of the few things that we can truly fear. Because the sea is totally and completely engulfing and enigmatic. And in addition to that, it is always waiting. It never relaxes, and is truly unpredictable. No matter how scientific your tests become, the sea is there. And yet, the myth that you love the sea continually moves around you. It's the myth that man does not love war. This is another great myth by which we live, that man is a logical, rational creature who does not like war and is led into war by insidious, cynical people. This is a great myth, one of the greatest myths. And it's a myth by which both sides live. This is a myth by which the Russians are living and a myth by which we are living, too. Of course, the cynical, rotten people always being the other side, invariably. It's a fascinating myth. Well, the other day, there's this little thing came out in the paper, and it was from San Francisco. And it is a wildly funny little item. And I read it to you. It's from the Associated Press. It's about, again, touching on the myth. Jeffrey M. Fletcher, craggy-faced captain of the British luxury liner Andes, has a confession to make about his 46 years at sea. I hate it, he told astonished reporters yesterday after the 27,000-ton vessel docked on its first visit to San Francisco. Why were they astonished? Because he said the truth. That's why. They were astonished because they, like everyone else, are part of the myth. I hate it. I'm afraid of it, he continued calmly, holding a cup of tea in one hand and his pipe in the other. You should see me at sea. You should see me at sea, especially in rough weather. I know what the sea can do. Captain Fletcher, a bluff English sea dog with a sparse thatch of gray hair and an engaging smile, received the press in his cabin aboard the flagship of the British Royal Mail. He disclosed that this is his last voyage before his retirement, when the Andes returns to Southampton on its round-the-world cruise. He was asked, and this is a great answer. Listen, doesn't this describe what happens to almost all of us in any profession we get into? He was asked, this is the most truthful interview I've read in years. He was asked, well, then, Captain, why did you go to sea in the first place? Well, it was sort of a family tradition, actually. I needed the dough. I went to sea at 15, and I'm 60 now. I've been too cowardly to change. Would you send your son to sea? I happen to be a bachelor, thank God, replied Captain Fletcher. Actually, the sea's not so bad when the sun is shining, but when the weather turns bad, I don't like it a bit. Oh, I don't go around trembling, of course. That wouldn't do, you know. I don't tremble, actually, but, you know, I actually don't like it. End of interview. Speaking of myths, this is WOR AM and FM, New York.
Well, that is a myth, because you're tuned to listener-sponsored WBAI New York, 99.5 FM. And now back to Gene Shepard from 1962.
And we'll be here until, man was only joking. What man? How does he know that? Oh, the World Telegram will not admit that he was saying the truth. They have to pretend that he's joking. Oh, yeah? The World Telegram has to prove its case to me other than the other way around. Believe me. You tell the truth and everyone has to say, oh, he's only kidding. You see, that's what happens. And I want just a little trick you learn in life. The more truthful you become, the better you can get by with it. Because one, nobody believes it when they hear it. And two, when they do hear it and believe it, they have to then make it sound like, oh, he's just kidding, or he's a kook, or what a fathead, he's a nut, take him out. Now, whether or not you can argue the truth of what the man said is totally beyond the point. Everyone has to make it into a joke. You're kidding there. And that's why now World Telegram, in its own little stumbling way, has hit on one of the great facts of humor. This is one of the reasons why Voltaire, when you read him, always sounds like he's just joking around. You know, he's saying funny little things. And Jonathan Swiftwater's of Weenanims and all those wahoos and yahoos and all just kid Gulliver and that, just funnies, little funnies, and Lewis Carroll, all the little funnies, all kinds of little funnies, like you know the funnies, and the poet has learned this many centuries ago. You know that the deeper you dig, the more you can become truthful. And as long as they don't listen carefully. The human races all live where time and space is. Their nature uniformly base is. The Nordic races hop around in continual metastasis, leaving hideous industrial traces. The Mongol races have flat faces and live in most extensive places. The Hamitic races play in jazz bands with wild grimaces and wear purple shoelaces. The Mediterranean races have many graces and like to fill their lives with embraces. The Semitic races divide their time between the oasis and the widest of wide open spaces. The Celtic races drink whiskey by the dozen cases. Each man can hold as much as his own weight displaces. The Alpine races live on top or halfway up or at the bases of mountains where the air is vilely cold but braces. The Coptic races walk in processions at unseemly paces, carrying enormous maces. The Carib races inhabit upturned carapaces, eating seaweed, mussel shell, and uncooked daces. The Balkan races live roughly northwest of the place where Thrace is. Their conduct a perpetual disgrace is. The human races all live where time and space is. Their nature uniformly base is. We walk along, and you know it's again a matter of perception. Tell them to write a letter. It's a matter of perception. It's a matter of wanting to perceive or wanting not to. I think that almost all of us, if we really want to pull it out, have so many secret fears, so many secret, not only really fears, but secret shadows that kind of walk along with us, not behind us or around us or behind us or in back of us or in front of us, but sort of walk in tandem with us. In tandem. And the feeling of a sort of universal dread is probably the most common of feelings. Whether we live by the myth or whether we live by the absurd or whether we live by the logique, and which, incidentally, is the most dangerous of all ways to live. Because the logique itself, you see, can be probably, unfortunately, the most colossal myth of all, you know? And so, I remember, you know, you have to relate back to history. Everybody has a little collection in his mind, in his memory, of first days. Do you know what I mean by first days? Like, let's say, the first day you were in high school. Or the first day you worked at your job. Or the first day you were in the army. Or the first day that you seemed to understand more than was really good for you. And there is a point where that begins to bother you. I don't know how many people out of 1,000 are ever troubled by this problem, but I'm sure it's more than most would ever admit. You know, speaking of first days, and I suspect that these first days are the most important of days. For example, if you go to a foreign country, your first day in a foreign city is going to be the most valuable day you will spend there. And for good reason. Because you are suddenly seeing, with new, fresh eyes, things which you will never notice again. And since you will never notice them again, you will never ever get to understand them. And so first days are extremely important. The first day you met someone who became a real part of your life. The first day, the really first time you knew this person, really. Those things are always floating around like a million little corks on the surface of our mind. And sometimes they're floating way back off there in shadow, in darkness, where you can't see them. I remember, speaking of first days, I suppose the most vivid first day that I have in my mind is the first day I ever worked in a steel mill. You know, again, this is a matter of perception and myth, and reality, dream, and the logique. What does a steel mill seem to you to be? If I say to you steel mill, what do you think of in your mind? How do you see it? Do you think that you've even approached it? Do you think you've even scratched the surface of a steel mill? Well, let me tell you about the first day. And remember this. I lived within 1.5 miles of most of my adolescent and childhood life. Within 1.5 miles of the greatest steel mills in America. So logically, I should know about steel mills, right? Logically, since most of the people who lived in the neighborhood worked in steel mills, the steel mill should not come as a surprise to me. Well, let me tell you about that first day. I remember this so vividly that it's as though it was some kind of a lithograph. Even better than that, a steel engraving hanging in this long corridor of my room, this room of the mind, with lights properly placed so they can be seen clearly. And I hardly ever think of it. I never look at it. It's like a picture that's in your house that you never look at. It's always there, you know? You walk in and out of the room, and there's this thing hanging. And you never look at it. And once in a while you look at it, and suddenly you say, yeah, Aristotle, contemplating a home of Buster. Yeah, there he is. You know? And it suddenly hits you again and again and again. And maybe one day you get so tired of this picture you throw it out. But you never can really throw it out because it's always somehow hanging in your memory. That first day. Let me tell you about the first day. The first day in the steel mill. I was working in what they call the mail department. Now, this is not the mail department like here at the Lieber House or at the 666 building or BBD&O or WOR. Oh, no, let me tell you that this is like being a mailman in a wild, fantastic, surrealistic city beyond all your conception. And it's a job that runs. You run constantly, and you're never in offices. You're running between great trains and screaming, howling cranes and falling pieces of metal and screaming, moving, swirling sparks constantly. And you run and run and run. And you run until you can't run anymore. And then they say, go home, come back and start running tomorrow. But I remember the first day, you see, because the steel mill is built out on the lake. You see, it's built on what they call made land. Do you know what made land is? This is land that's filled. The land moves out on a kind of slag base and foundation. This is made. It's like an animal, you see, that builds its own shell as it goes, you know? You know what I mean? That the ground that the steel mill is on is made out of the waste of the steel mill. It's perpetual motion. They just keep dumping it in the lake, and every so often they say, Charlie, we got 3 more acres now, for crying out loud, sticking out there. And they roll it down with a roller, and they build another mill on it. Eventually, I suspect the steel mill will stretch all the way to northern Canada, like a giant peninsula, all the way up the lake, and finally it'll work its way down Lake Ontario, and eventually could very well dock off the battery here, like a big snake going all the way up the St. Lawrence. I'm not kidding you. That's the way it is. And eventually it's going to be one big mill. And you get that feeling, you know, when you're working in it, like you're working in a cancer. You just don't know which. It's going bigger and bigger, and it's always being built, never being torn down, being built. Well, I'm a kid, remember. And I'm 16. I go down and I get my working permit. And this is a very exciting moment, you see. And I'm going to work, and school has just gotten out. And I have, like they say out in the steel mill, you got to have a drag. Well, everybody had to have a drag. By the way, is there anybody out there who does honestly have a drag? You know, I say, you know, is anybody out there who's really got a drag? Or is that a Midwestern expression again? You never heard the expression? Huh? Pull. No. Pull has to do with City Hall. No, seriously. That's a very different thing. We used to use that expression, oh, he's got pull down City Hall. No, I said, oh, boy, that guy's got a drag somewhere. That really means that, you know, you really got something going in the mill, you know, that there's an important guy, you know. Well, it's a funny thing. Being an amateur radio operator, it was funny. I was on the air. I'm this little feckless youth, and I'm on 160 meters. And so I find one night that I'm sitting there talking to the superintendent of the rolling mill. Actually, it was the superintendent of the roll shop. I mean, this is like talking to God out there. No, you have no idea how important this is. And I suddenly began to sweat. Because really, it's like a little actor somewhere finds himself on the telephone with Daryl Zanuck. Oh, you know, you just don't expect to do this. And I'm sitting there, I'm talking. Hi, Gil, how are you, boy? You're coming in here, so and so, blah blah blah. A pair of 2A5s in the final here, Class B modulation. Yeah, I'm using a double extended ZEP with 600 ohm feed. Yeah, blah blah. What do you do, Gil? I'm going to Hammond High. I'd like to know what you do over there. So, okay, Gil, come on in. Let's on. Gil comes back and he says, I'm the foreman of the rolling mill in Inland Steel. You know. Oh, I'm out in a sweat like that. Well, I don't know how to get around to it, you know. So I say, yeah, well, that's a very interesting job you must have there, Mr. Gil. That's a very interesting job you got there. The steel mill, huh? Well, by George, you know, it's a coincidence, Gil. You know, there's nothing I wanted to work in more than the steel mill. Strangely enough, you know, I've always been interested in rolls. And, you know, oddly enough, I'm getting out of school next week. And say, Gil, I wonder if, you know, I don't want to put you in any trouble, but, well, anyway, to make a long story short, this poor, friendly, kindly man called me, and I went down to his his home. He called, he said, come on over some night. And he lived about 3 miles away. And, gee, I was in the superintendent's home. And here was this feckless youth. And he said, look, son. He said, and by the way, this was when jobs were not easy to get. And he says, look, son, you take this tomorrow morning. Take this to the clock house, the number 1 clock house. Well, of course, this was a name that was so familiar to me. It's like, say, take it to the MGM main gate. Say this to a bid actor in Hollywood. He knows about this. It's a famous thing. He says, take this to the number 1 clock house, and you show this to the man who's inside the little office just as you get in, and he will send you down to the place where you'll be talked to. And he said, I'll call him, and it'll be all set. Well, I'll tell you, that night I couldn't sleep. Oh, boy. I was sweating. I told my mom, I says, I got a job in the mill. She says, you're going to work in the mill? Of course, immediately, mothers, the mill is this monster over here, and once in a while you hear this big booming sound and sirens going and ambulances and all, the whole bit. Immediately, mothers suspect that the ocean is going to swallow you up, and that's it, and spit you out, nothing but core and seeds and stuff. Well, anyway, oh, no, don't worry about me, Ma. So that morning, and I forgot to mention that he told me that I should get to the clock house about 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. Oh, well, that's the mill. It's like the sea. The mill is like the sea and like the Great Plains. You don't sleep, the crops are taken in early. So I go down there, and I got this paper, and boy, I'll tell you, I'll never forget it. I drive this little car I had this little V8. I park it in the great big parking lot. Millions of cars where the mill was. And the sun was just coming up, It was just getting bright, just getting light. And there's a strange chill around the steel mill. I cannot explain this. Do you know the chill that exists around totally inhuman things like crypts? Have you ever been inside of a pyramid? You haven't. Have you ever been inside of a great temple of some kind made of stone? Well, there is a chill, a strange, unearthly, inhuman chill. Well, I parked my car, and I'm wearing this T-shirt because back home it was warm, It's summertime, it's June. And I get out of the car, and I walk through the parking lot, and this chill is beginning to reach out and get me. It's funny, I'm cold. The first time, cold, and it's not cold like that there. And it's beginning to get chilly. Well, I get on the main pathway, which is a big concrete areaway that leads to the number 1 clock house. And there are thousands of men walking towards me and walking with me. And this was the first peculiar, strange premonition, intimation I had that life isn't exactly the way it seems to be. Not exactly. Now, I do not know what it is. I've spent my life since trying to figure out just what it is. But it isn't what it seems to be. Because here were all these men. They were all walking. And they were walking fast, going towards the mill. And there were great crowds of them coming back. And they had a kind of dead look on their faces, which I cannot describe except to say that it was the kind of deadness that is, well, it's deadness that is alive. A dead quality of a kind of, how can I say it except to say that it's like an automobile or a machine that looks like it's moving fast, but it's got a burnt-out clutch. And it stands in the garage, beautifully streamlined and leaning forward. But it's not going to go. And there is a quality of deadness about a car in a garage. And yet, it looks alive. Does this mean anything? And these men were all walking, and they were all wearing lumberjacks, and they had hats on with buttons and stuff. And there I am jostling there with my cotton T-shirt on, and I'm getting cold. Now, I don't know whether I was getting cold because of the mill or because of this aura that is emanated from this strange place. Well, I finally got into the clock house, and thousands of guys are going through. The clock house is just that. It's the place where you punch in. And remember, this steel mill employed something like 41,000 men. Divide it by 3, and that's the number of men that went through that clock house 3 times a day. You see, there were 3 shifts. And so this enormous push is going through, and I walk up to the man, It was in the little desk there. And somehow my idea of work and working in the mill was completely different from this. I gave him my sheet of paper, which Mr. whatever his name was had written down something. Call so-and-so, call number so-and-so, check on this kid or whatever it was he wrote. And the guy didn't say a word to me. He just looked down, okay. Picked up the phone. He dialed something. He says, Mr. So-and-so, blah, blah. Yeah. Okay. He hangs up. He says, all right, kid, get in the bus. And he says, go down to, tell him you want to get off at the number 1 stores. One of the guys will tell you where the number 1 stores is. I said, number 1 stores, you know. And suddenly it was becoming very real. And up to this point, working in the steel mill had been an idea. Now, you see what I mean about the myth and the reality? It had been an idea. Suddenly he says, get off at number 1 stores. Well, I had an idea. Stores. What is the stores? You know, stores. I could see places where guys bought chewing tobacco, you know, this kind of thing, and ice cream cones and stuff. Well, I get into this bus, and there was the bus, and it was a long, flat, strange conveyance where men sat all hock to hock. It was a bus that looked like it was 200 feet long, and it was made out of a black, strange, rough, welded sheet metal. And the windows were wide open. There were no windows at all, just big squares cut out of the sheet metal. And suddenly, again, I was faced with the reality of everything is there's no nicety. You know what I mean? And we're sitting on this long metal seat. And on the other side are these guys all sitting in long metal things, and everyone is just sort of just looking ahead, carrying lunch buckets, and the sun is coming up over the lake. And remember, it's June. I have just gotten out of school. Do you know what spring vacation, summer vacation is? It was no time now. There was absolutely no season. It was nothing. I was in a foreign country, not only a foreign country, a foreign world. And I'm sitting. And we go, the bus, you can't hear anything. It's made of sheet metal. Have you ever ridden in a sheet metal bus with big, flat, solid rubber tires, no air in them, just, and riding over what they call a slag road? A slag road is a road that's made out of big chunks of iron slag packed down deep. And I'm aware around me, as I look out through this window, no longer is the steel mill a thing that you see on the horizon. It's no longer even a thing that can be recognized, you see, because you can recognize things on the horizon. You can recognize the moon from here. On the surface of the moon, you won't be able to. You can recognize problems in Katanga from here. But in Katanga, you can't. I can assure you of that. You can recognize what should be done by the administration here. But when you're sitting at a big oak table with the foreign ministers from Nairobi, you can't. And so I'm sitting in this bus, and it's going, and I see outside of these windows. I don't want to look eager, you know. That's the worst thing when you get into a terrible foreign country or a strange world, is to let everyone know that you're not a native. And so I'm sitting, but I'm looking out casually, you know, and I see these great buildings on either side, so close that you could reach out and brush them with your hands. Big square cutouts in the buildings, and I could see enormous ingots, boom, boom, back and forth, sparks, and it sounded like, to the ear which was not trained, it sounded like there was nothing but a continual scream cutting the air. A great, great scream of all the machinery, everything all together. And I'm sitting. I'm sitting, and I said to the guy next to me, say, you know where number 1 stores is? Number 1 stores? You want that, kid? I said, number 1 stores. I want to get, I don't know where they are. And he turns, and somebody sitting across from me says, number 1 store, to tell... Hey, Jerry, number 1 store, isn't that down there by the number 3? Down by the number 3 AC down there. Kid, get off by number 3 AC. You're closer there. Well, I didn't know whether to, say, well, I don't know where number 3 AC is. So I sat for a couple of minutes, and I just sat. And finally we got to a place where a lot of men got off. And I looked out. I thought I'd see something that says number 3 AC. Nothing. Just great black buildings, smoke and steam, and right next to me, right out, you could reach out. Have you ever been 3 inches from the side of a steam engine? Steam came into the bus. Oh, I'm sitting, I'm really worried now. I don't know what I'm getting into. And finally, I thought, well, I'll have to get off. So I got off with all these men, and the bus continued to go with half of the men off into the distance, and there I am. Well, there was an office into which maybe 25 guys went. And so I get in, I walk in the office, and there's a man with a guard's uniform, and I said, I'm looking for the number 1 stores. Number 1 stores, kid, that's another mile and a half down there. He says, it's past the 14-inch mill. What are you doing here? I said, well, how do you get there? Well, the bus is gone, kid. Just go on, walk down there past the 14-inch mill. You'll see it. It's right past the 14-inch mill. Ask for Hennessy. Past the 14-inch mill, ask for Hennessy. Well, I went walking down this road. And this road was not a road like you think of roads for cars. It was a road for what they call hot metal cars. Great zeppelins filled with molten steel came moving down, and I could feel the heat from perhaps 200 or 300 yards away, and I'm hiding, cowering next to this building. And I kept walking and walking and walking, and sure enough, believe it or not, there was a sign that said 14-inch merchant mill. 14-inch merchant mill shipping dock. I'm getting there. So I walk up to the dock there where these guys are all sitting there. A couple of them have got big air hammers strung over their back, and I says, any of you men know where Hennessy is? Hennessy? Who? Hennessy? Bob Hennessy and the coal strip? I said, no, Hennessy in the stores. Hennessy. Hey, Chuck, do you know Hennessy in the stores? Never heard of him, kid. Well, where are the stores? Oh, they're down just around the next turn. You go right past the AC shop. You'll see the AC shop, and there's the stores there. Well, I made the turn, and there's the AC shop, and finally there was a little sign over the doorway. It says, do not enter stores unless you have a pass from your foreman. I had no pass. So I go up to the door. I figure they're going to let me in. I said to the fellow, I have to see Mr. Hennessy in the stores. Where's your pass, kid? Well, to finally get it down to the basic point, I finally arrived in the stores. And I'm sitting there, and here's a man comes out. He said, I'm going to fit you with safety shoes, kid. I see you got a note from Columbus. You got to get to work. The stores where they give you safety shoes and goggles. I said, well, what am I going to do? Well, I don't know. That's none of my business, kid, huh? You're working for Columbus over there. You're working for Columbus over in stationary shipping. I have no... What the note says, don't come and ask me about that. That's not my problem, kid. You get safety shoes and goggles. And I walked out of the stores with a big pair of safety shoes that weighed 40 pounds each and a pair of goggles. And the sound rose and rose and rose and rose. It was screaming and hollering around me. I had nowhere to go, no place to go. I had no point of reference. And I went into a doorway where there was a telephone. I picked up the telephone and I instinctively dialed 0. And I got this voice on the phone. It was the operator, the plant operator. I said, I want to talk to Mr. Columbus, please. Mr. Columbus. He says, yes, Mr. Columbus, who is the superintendent of the rolling shop. Oh, yes, Mr. Columbus, of course, sir. She thought I was a big man. I get Mr. Columbus and say, hi, Gil. Hey, Gil, this is W9QWN. I'm over here in the 2AC, Gil. Will you please come and get me? Well, 20 minutes later, I'm in the stationary shipping department. And that was only the beginning. That day, I learned something very important. I haven't discovered yet what it is.
This is WOR.
No, it's WBAI in New York. And that was Gene Shepard from February the 15th of 1962. And I suppose next week, why not? We'll hear the show from February 19th, 1962, from the same tape, from a secret source. Actually, no, it's not that secret. What does it say here? From Palo Alto Microsystems. Gene Shepard tapes are provided not-for-profit production of Palo Alto Microsystems. So there you go. So we thank you, Palo Alto. And we'll have more next week. And I've been Max Schmid. Next week we'll be back exploring the popular music of the mid-1960s for the first 90 minutes of the show, and then close out with another episode of Vic and Sade and Gene Shepard. I'll also be back here Sunday night at 7:30 for the golden age of radio. The last show before the big fun drive begins. So stand by and we'll figure out what the schedules are going to be for those programs. And don't forget the Friends of Old Time Radio Convention coming up the 19th to the 22nd of this month out at the Newark Holiday Inn North. That's what I'm driving towards at this point. But time to go. So I will see you next week or Sunday night. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for a wake-up call, which will follow after a few important announcements.
From February 19, 1962, at auction, a genuine elephant's leg umbrella stand. A street Louis man breaks into the zoo and frees 46 cages of snakes. Talking to ants and rats. Driving a bed in Britain without a license. Part of the opening theme has been deleted.
Oh my, 5:14. We should be starting Gene Shepard, but I need to remind you very quickly about the Friends of Old Time Radio Convention. And all I have time to do is give you the contact information. If you don't know about it by now, check the World Wide Web, lofcom.com, and find the nostalgia section, then FOTR for Friends of Old Time Radio. 25th Annual Convention, gathering of the celebrities and stars who performed in radio programming, as well as dealers room galore, panels, and so forth. I'll be doing a Gene Shepard panel Friday at noon. The dates are October the 19th, a Thursday, through the 22nd, Sunday morning. Daytime registration and full day, including the evening banquets, are available. For pricing information and schedules, contact Jay Hickerson, the chairman of the convention. His phone number, we'll just give you his phone number. To hell with writing. It's too late now. 203-248-2887, 203-248-2887, or email him, jhick@aol.com, Jayhick at AOL.com, or check the World Wide Web, www.lofcom.com/nostalgia/FOTR. Time for our Gene Shepard episode of the morning, another lost and restricted episode from 1962. Specifically, the hell is the date? February the 19th, 1962, featuring Mankind and His Stuff and the Divinely Absurd. So, well, without further ado, let's get it moving. Here's Gene.
Over the weekend, I spent about 3 hours watching these canned television shows. You know, the realistic kind, where there's a scene where the cops wind up chasing the guy around the roof. Have you ever seen, around the roofs of the buildings up and down the west side there over by the docks? And they shoot it out, and the lovely girl who winds up getting involved in the third reel, he's tearing down the fire escape, and he jumps into the room there, and he's always in the room with her, this beautiful girl. Well, I saw at least 7 of those over the weekend, and they're running around on the roofs. And I came to a conclusion there. These are called realistic television shows, because they're shot on real fire escapes. and on real roofs. Wouldn't it be fantastic if life really was like that? I mean, really, wouldn't it be if every 20 minutes you hear them shooting it out up on the roofs, you know, you go over in the 40s there, over by the roof, pow, 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 and Rocco the Lip, you see us swinging up and down the fire escapes, and there's a beautiful girl wearing a shawl. Oh, Rocco, please, I love you. Wouldn't it be wild? Oh, and think of the great headlines, and think of the wonderful newspaper stories. Every day you could pick up the newspapers, you know, and there would be all those stories in the paper about all these fantastic things, and invariably in every story it would say that Rocco the Lip, while he was being chased up this alley, ran into this beautiful girl who had just come in on the boat from Italy someplace, and she was a beautiful girl, had a strange, striking resemblance to Elizabeth Taylor, and she fell instantly in love with him, and she didn't know he was a crook, but nevertheless, in the last, wouldn't it be just, but once in the great while, though, something pops up right out of the paper that makes all of that jazz look like kid stuff, but kid stuff. And you never know where it's going to happen. Now, yes, by the way, before we go any further, I would like to say that tonight's text is not for women and children. And if you fall into either one of those categories, I suggest you go down to WPAT maybe. They've got some nice ear-to-ear music. I imagine QXR now has a nice Haydn string quartet on. A couple of other stations got these gigantic recorded fist fights with these guys hollering through their nose. You might like that. And, you get a lot of things you can do. You don't have to, so please, without kicking chairs over and please leave now. Now, getting back to our text here, did you read that wild story over the weekend? Now, I tell you how I happened to read it. I was walking along 3rd Avenue, and along 3rd Avenue, way over there on the east side there, all kinds of little places where they sell used Victorian lamps and elephant's foot umbrella stands. Hey, by the way, did you ever see an elephant's foot umbrella stand? A real one? Well, one time I'm in an auction, and it's a great auction. And I really dig going to auctions, especially auctions when they're selling some old recluse's estate. And, they've got all this wild stuff there, and they're selling it all out. And the auctioneer is trying to make everybody believe that it's wonderful stuff. And I'm sitting down in the crowd on the camp chairs. They have these little stores with the camp chairs all sitting there, and up on a little stage is the auctioneer. And he's selling the estate of this well-known, very ancient, and very eccentric recluse who lived on the outside of Cincinnati, and he made all kinds of dough in the yeast business. So right there, he's got a lot of stuff going. You could tell it, right? He made yeast. So this old gentleman had passed into the great beyond, and he left behind him a collection of effluvia, the like of which the average pack rat could not even comprehend. And here's all this stuff. He had a chandelier that must have been 7 stories high, just the chandelier, and it had cut glass crystal balls and little cut glass crystal fringe hanging, and each candle. Now this was the final, the little Philippe. Each candle, imitation candles, with a little light bulb at the top. Each candle was held in a brass fist. Now get that, sticking out of this great big pile of glass. But you haven't heard the end of it. On each brass fist, right below each brass fist, on each brass wrist was a brass cuff. And sticking out of each brass cuff was a rhinestone cufflink. How about that? This thing was 7 stories tall. I almost bought it for my pad. Oh, boy, 378 bulbs going all at once. Held aloft in a brass fist with a brass cuff with a rhinestone cufflink. Hey, George, now, I say you cannot give up on mankind if he's capable of this kind of stuff. I'm just talking about mankind in general. So anyway, I'm sitting there, and they got this big chandelier up there, and the auctioneer, is up there. He's pounding away with a gavel, and all of his assistants are bringing stuff up. And he says, and now we have number 172, number 172 in the catalog, number 172 in the catalog, a genuine pachyderm, a genuine African pachyderm umbrella stand, a genuine African pachyderm umbrella stand. This is a pure piece of Victorian artwork, a very rare piece of Victorian artwork, and probably the like of which will seldom be seen again on the face of the earth. A beautiful piece which undoubtedly will go for hundreds of dollars more than we are asking for it this afternoon, number 172 in the catalog. Will you please bring it up? Well, they put up on the stand there an elephant's foot. Actually, it was an elephant's leg. Oh, boy, cut off at the knee. And there's this elephant's leg standing with the toenails. A real elephant's leg. And sticking out of the elephant's leg there, they had hollowed it out somehow. I don't know how they hollowed it out, and they had a brass thing set down in the middle of it. And sticking out of it were a couple of sample canes. And he said, number 172, number 172, number 172, number 172, a genuine pachyderm umbrella stand, genuine pachyderm umbrella stand. I guess he was using the phrase pachyderm because he figured that everybody, if they didn't look really sharply enough, would think it was teak wood or something else equally acceptable outside of an elephant's knee. Have you ever looked at an elephant's knee, really? Cut off there at the top with an umbrella sticking out? So he's going, well, I'm looking at this thing, and I think, by George, you can't give up hope. You just can't give up hope. And over the weekend, I'm walking along on 3rd Avenue, and they got all these shops where they're selling stuff like that, They're selling little paddle wheel steamers, and they're selling all kinds of just effluvia, all the junk. Can you imagine what it would be like if mankind somehow disappeared from the face of the earth tomorrow and left all his stuff behind him? Just left it, Just even better than that, I would love to see a pile of all the junk. Just the junk of mankind piled up. I wonder how high it would reach, this pile. How big the base would be. How much it would weigh. And how many hopes it would contain. How many distorted, wild, strange, beautiful, exquisite, circumscribed dreams all piled up there. With those plastic streetcars and those leather whales and those elephants' toes. Oh, boy. While I'm walking down there, I'm looking in the window, see, and I figure, well, this is a part of man that has no relationship to his action. You follow me here? It's the stuff like you drip off, you know what I mean? It just sort of, it's the slough off of man. It doesn't have any real relationship to what he does. Well, I'm walking along 3rd Avenue, and I come to this little newsstand, and there on the newsstand is a pile of newspapers. And I'm walking past, and suddenly a story just came right out of the page. I don't read. I'm not a nipper. You know what I mean by a nipper? It's the kind of guy, that walks over and reads the front page of the paper and then goes on. This is a nipper. And boy, they are the bane of the newspaper sellers. You know that the newspaper sellers learn very quickly in the game just how to place that iron weight. So the headline sort of catches you, but you can't read it. You know what I mean? They place it at just such an angle so you can get just a suggestion of gigantic and that's all. And then underneath it says 1700 X, and that's it, with a big red thing on the top. And you say, whoo, what's this? And you go over there. You can't just take the thing, and lift it off and look. Because he's looking, he's standing right, so you wind up by popping for it. And then all you get is the true life story of Marilyn Monroe. So anyway, I'm walking past, and there's this story. I stopped, and I bought a newspaper for one story. It was the story that came out of St. Louis over the weekend. Did you read this thing? An unbelievable story. It told about an incident that happened at night in the St. Louis Zoo. Have you ever been, first of all, in the St. Louis Zoo? You have to understand the St. Louis Zoo is not like the zoo here. It's not like Central Park. Central Park Zoo is a comparatively citified zoo. There are buildings all around it, and things are pretty much under control. But the St. Louis Zoo is a big zoo, and it's set in trees and so on, and it's almost as though it's removed from let's say from civilization. It's a big zoo, and it's a good zoo. But at night, this is what happened. The guard, who's just on duty there, fooling around, sees a man a big man. This man weighed over 200 pounds, big, tall guy, and somehow he walked with a strange walk. He was walking very stiff-legged, and his shoulders didn't move. He walked, the way the guard put it, he walked like a zombie. Well, you know what a zombie is? A zombie is more than a phrase. A zombie has to do with all kinds of Caribbean voodoo cults. A zombie is in effect a dead man who has been reanimated and who has been set into motion, a kind of Frankenstein. Well, anyway, here's this guy at night, and the guard sees him, and he says, gee, you know, it looked a little suspicious. And so he went over and got a policeman. And just as he got the policeman, the man started to walk up a hill toward the reptile house. Now, this is a kind of a hilly zoo. It's built on plains and angles, and there are slow-rolling hills with trees all around. And it's all set in, and it must have been pitch black. But he walked up this sharp inclined plane, and the policeman is being summoned, and the guard leaves the policeman area where he had called up for a cop, turns and runs after the man. Now, you got the picture? The man arrives at the front door of the reptile house, and with fantastic strength, he tears the brass bars down that had barred the door, tore aside a screen, and ripped open the door, and walked right into the reptile house, carrying with him a long metal pole, like a pipe or something. He walked right down the middle of the reptile house, smashing the reptile cages, one after the other. Well, the man behind him, the guard, is clinging to his back and hitting him on the head with the butt of his pistol, banging him on the head, screaming at him to stop this. The man paid absolutely not the slightest heed to him, and the blows didn't even seem to affect him. He's just banging him on the head, screaming, and a policeman arrived, and they're struggling with this man, and he just kept walking down the center of the reptile house, smashing cages as he went, until finally he smashed 46 cages in that darkened house. With that, he turns, moves right up the aisle, out the front door, down through the bushes, over a fence, and into a car he had waiting, and was gone without a word. And of course, the snakes are all out and writhing. Half of them were poisonous snakes. One of the guards rushed in, grabbed a hold of a rattlesnake by its head, and shoved it right back in and slammed a box over it. There were 46 cages busted open. Luckily, he missed the deadly African black mamba, which would have really gone to town had he gotten out. But what a story! What a story! What makes this story even more probably frightening? Speaking of the fright, this is WOR AM and FM New York.
And speaking of snakes in charge, this is WBAI New York.
And we're 40 years old here, WOR is. And we show every year of it. But nevertheless, now don't write in. I'm just talking about WOR now. They know what I mean. And I'm one of the family, so I can say it. Shut up. So you know what makes this story more grotesque than just perhaps it's a thing that's beyond your imagination. In other words, what psychological dilemma was this man in that made him break open the cages of snakes at night in the St. Louis Zoo? He did not attack people. We can understand men attacking people, you know? We can understand men attacking animals. This we can understand. But a man seemingly possessed, seemingly somehow with a great fixation, moving through the dark, breaking glass cages to reptiles, is almost, it's the kind of story that you don't know whether, if it were written, you want to know what now? What now? And there was immediately a great search was instigated was set into motion in St. Louis. But as far as I know, there has not been another word on the story. Have you heard any more about it? Did you hear the story? Isn't that a wild one? Well, now, if you're confronted with a thing like this, how can anybody say? Now, this is one person, one human being. Remember, this is a human being, just like you are. Now, how can anyone try to pretend that there is some kind of absurd logic that man follows in his convolutions through time and space? I'm talking about all of mankind, and I'm not even attempting to in any way, shape, or form apply an overall or a universal meaning to what this man did. He is a man, though. And he did something beyond the imagination of men. Even beyond fictional imagination, really. Now you can say, well, he wanted to set the snakes free. That's why. No. That's a very bad explanation. Because from the stories, from the way it came out, he seemed to be doing it with a ferocity that had little or nothing to do with snakes themselves, per se. Now, I'm sure somebody who is an animal lover would say, well, I felt like that many a time going to the zoo. Oh, no. Not quite. And apparently, this was done with forethought. There was a car waiting. You know, I've often regretted not buying that elephant's foot. I really have. Because if I had that elephant's foot, I would put it next to my desk. It would cause great consternation here at WOR, but it would remind me of something. It would remind me of snake cage smashers. It would remind me of chandeliers with phony candles being held aloft by brass hands. Yes. Oh, lost, oh, gone, oh, Pegeen. But here we are. We're faced with the reality of it, and yet you know you can't slough it off. You know, people say, well, that's just a nut. No, that doesn't answer it. What do you mean, just a nut? You can't just say it that way. People have these beautiful little pat phrases that seem to be applied to everything, like, oh, I'm in love. That's the end of it. Or, oh, you know, he's a man. Have you ever heard that phrase? As if that covers it. That says something. Or, well, what are you going to do these days? What do you mean, what are you going to do these days? What would you do any days? What if you were living in 1166 or 1060? Yeah, what are you going to do these days? They're fighting all the time out there with their arrows and jazz. Crying out loud. That doesn't answer anything. Half of the things we say don't answer anything. So don't come back and say he was a nut. That doesn't answer it at all. Speaking of, you know, all right, now I'll give you, how about answer, please, number 2. Yeah, that's right. Answer this one now. Put, this one. No. Hold it there, boys. No. That's better. Hold it now. Now we have great respect, of course, for all the storied knowledge, well, let us say the assembled attitudes. By the way, speaking of the assembled attitudes, any of you ever read a book by Angus Wilson called The Anglo-Saxon Attitudes? A magnificent title for a book. The Anglo-Saxon Attitudes. We dip. Peer. All together. Peers of the realm last night pondered the case of a noble lord who said his mother-in-law got rid of rats by talking to them. The House of Lords snapped to the alert as Air Chief Marshal Lord Doubting. Right out of Lewis Carroll, Air Chief Marshal Lord Doubting announced his belief in the vocal method of scaring vermin.
Lord Dowding, a 70-year-old spiritualist who masterminded Britain's heroic fighter force in the World War II Battle of Britain, recommended an American book describing the system. He said the book, Kinship with All Life, tells of a man who cleared his house of ants by telling them of his admiration for their industry and their communal spirit. My wife's mother, said Lord Dowding, had a plague of rats in her chicken pen. She practiced this cure, and the fowl runs. The chicken coops were cleared of rats. We ourselves have cleared our house of rats and mice by similar methods. The lords sat up and blinked. All of them assembled in the House of Lords itself. Up rose Earl Bathurst, Undersecretary of the Home Office, who allowed that some people do have extraordinary powers over animals. But if we all set about acquiring the powers of Lord Dowding, we shall merely push our rats and other vermin upon some other individual who does not have these powers. Oh, the wonderful spirit of fair play that exists among the English. Lord Dowding confessed that, alas, such was the case. On the last occasion that my wife's mother cleared her chicken coops, she found that next day her neighbor said, I cannot imagine what has happened. My garden is swarming with rats. Hold it there. Hold it. Stop it. Just cut it out, all of you guys. Now look it. If you really examine the case of the elephant knee, you will realize that there is a logic to it. There is a logic to everything. Everything fits. Don't you understand that there isn't a single itsy-bitsy wee tiny drop that does not somehow fit into the overall scheme? And as you're probably aware, the British long ago, in many ways, explored this theme itself. Oh, yes, boil and bubble, toil and trouble. Oh, no. Thou shalt not push me beyond the cliff. So spake indeed the Lord, withdrawing from its scabbard his long, thin war saber. Oh, you shall not push me beyond the cliff. I shall fight. With my back to the white cliffs of Dover. I shall fight till the very last blood of... We have here a news item dateline London, February 15th. A court in Aldershot ruled today that if you want to drive your bed through the streets, you must display L or learner plates, obtain proper automobile insurance, hang license plates at either end, and install a braking system. Richard Brown, a 19-year-old student who did not follow these rules, was fined the equivalent of $36 and suspended from driving beds or cars for 1 month. He drove his bed, powered by a motorcycle engine, for 2.5 miles through Farnborough 5 months ago. The processional committee that fined him was also held for aiding and abetting Mr. Brown. Incidentally, today the student, who is now in the Royal Aircraft Establishment, is the only known bedstead driver in the country. He was barred from the road. However, we were watching and will watch this youth's procedure in the future with a great deal of interest. All together now. All together. Hold it there. Hold it, all of you. Hold it. Stop it. Stop. Oh. Now, it's just emotionalism will get us nowhere. Did I tell you about the time the lady... Of course, this is the kind of thing that you don't like to tell children. And if there are any children awake, all I have to say is that you're going to learn it somewhere. And there was this lady who lived out in Cincinnati. I'll just tell you the true story of it. I might as well lay it right out here on the line. There was a lady one time when I was working in Cincinnati, and I saw the incident happen. I will never forget it, because it was one of those things, you know. It wouldn't make the Reader's Digest, but let me tell you, it made my psyche. It also made my day. I was walking, you know, Cincinnati is a very hilly town, you know, very up, you know, up, down, so on. And I'm going uphill one day on Vine Street, and you won't believe this, but I saw a lady who seemed to be otherwise normal and all right, riding in an automatic washer down the middle of Vine Street in Cincinnati, going downhill against the wind. This chick went through 2 lights and didn't do anything but just sit and wave at people. Well, I saw her go past, you know. And, it was... Oh, you're interested in what? Well, it was a Maytag. And I waved at her when she went past. And she was sitting in the clothes dryer compartment. You know, they have 2 compartments. She's sitting in the clothes dryer compartment. And somehow I had the feeling that she had a companion when she started out. And he stopped off somewhere. And I just went right on, disappeared in the distance, and I never heard another word about him. I saw it happen. I was expecting to read about it in the paper, but you know they hush up the real stuff. Everybody's covering up. By the way, are you covering up? Oh. Stop, cut it out, you guys. Speaking of covering up. Oh, well, you see, the reason I told the women and children to get out, and I feel very good about it now, since it's quite obvious that the theme that came out was the theme that we had calculated would all along. And that's that thin thread of the divinely absurd which runs through all of the actions of all of us. You don't think for a minute that countries, big countries, I don't care, name any big country, really wants to disarm? Do you really? Well, that's all that history's ever been about, is wars and what happened just after them. No, seriously. It's like telling some guy whose whole world has been based on killing cockroaches that from now on he's got to give up killing cockroaches. Stop it. No, seriously, it's not going to work. And it's interesting to note that every time there is a disarmament, any kind of disarmament talk, everybody gets all flustered. Everyone suspects a trick on the other guy's part, of course. And so, naturally, people disarm disarm in the mind, and then they arm more in reality to prevent any such tricks like this happening. It sort of piles up one after the other until finally we wind up with tiny little bursts of impatience that have nothing at all to do with disarmament or armament. It's just kind of the bubble festering to the top, the boil on the of the psyche. Just pops like that, you know. And there's this little thing, you know, comes out of the news. I mean, it just says, the letters to the editor. It says, Brooklyn, won't the transit authority do something about them fans? Why don't they do something about them fans in the new IRT and BMT cars? They've been in operation all winter. Signed a frozen sardine, rotten bums. Hold it there, rotten bums. I don't blame you, Dad. When are they going to get on us? So when is that? Oh, of course, this is all part of the same thing. It's like the other day I'm listening to shortwave and I don't recall what country it was. It was Romania or one of them. They have all these English newscasts on.
And you listen really carefully to this, and you begin to note that in the voice there is the sound of a man or a woman, usually women. They use a lot of women newscasters over there. These people really believe it, which is really frightening, because we really believe what we say. And yet nobody really does. You know what I mean? If you carry it all the way to the furthest extent, it's just a lot of talk. I mean, I'm all over. The world is, in fact, composed of talk. So everybody, we're going to shoot this rocket up now, with a guy in it. And so everybody talks about all the scientific information we're going to get. That isn't why we're doing it. We want to see if we can shoot a rocket up. It's like kids, when a kid is going to do something, when he's going to throw a rock up in the air to see how high it goes, he doesn't try to pretend, that what he's doing it is to measure air currents on rocks. He just throws the rock, he lets her go, Well, as man gets older, he does the same thing. He throws rocks up in the air. Or he breaks windows, which is the equivalent of a war. But as he gets older, being mature, he has to learn all kinds of ridiculous rationalizations for it. This is a kind of maturity, We call it maturity. So he invents all these economic things, and he invents all these wild, beautiful stories. Like we have to have the information on the upper air currents on the sporadic E layer there, up around the Van Allen belt. We've got to have that information. So we wind up, nobody knows why, but we wind up, putting $87 billion into a gigantic rock to throw up, and I can only say, fine. I can say there's nothing wrong with that, actually. Because what else is there to do on the earth anyway, really? Because this is the kind of talk that women, I'm not quite sure, understand, because I don't think they have the same kind of itch that men have. That the itch that men have to throw things as far as they can be thrown, to fly up as high as you can fly, to jump as high as you can jump. All these things are tied up, biologically, psychologically, and everything else, with the problem of being male. Women don't have this problem, obviously. They have others. But what they have, you see, men do not understand in an equal measure. Now, I'm sure that all the women who are listening say, what does he mean? I understand men. Oh, no. No, you don't, any more than the man really understands your basic motives. We have a few little areas of common boundary we share, men and women. Few areas of common discussion points. But it's like two. Do you understand what I mean, Ed? It's really like two races sending notes to each other, written in two different languages, but vaguely written the same way. So here we're going to send these things up, and I think that more and more, of course, it's not a matter of thinking. I know this is a fact that more and more psychologists are becoming interested in mankind as a whole rather than the individual ill. And more and more, they're beginning to impinge or to dissect that little area there, that little itch that mankind has had, to throw things up as high as they can throw it, to see what'll happen, just to see what'll happen. That explains a lot. If you do something and you say, well, I just wanted to see what would happen, that's right. But what does it explain, you see? It doesn't really explain why you want to see what would happen. And so this incessant, insensate drive for knowledge and for understanding of the physical universe has led us into some very interesting paths. But we've never really explained why we want to know these things, really. Now, there can be some very loose, broad generalizations, and I might say rationalizations. For example, it betters the lot of man on earth. Do you really believe that? Do you really believe you're happier than, say, somebody who lived 500 years ago? Really happier? On the other hand, you see, the guys who live 500 years from now are going to have things you don't know about. Are you unhappy about it? Do you feel a terrible sense of being cheated because you don't have the instantaneous telepathic method of non-communication which people will have in the year 2750? Do you think Washington felt cheated because he never saw gun smoke? Seriously, But we like to think they did, that the poor old Jefferson left this mortal coil feeling cheated. Right, George? He just missed out. Just missed out on VistaVision. If he'd have stuck around, he might have seen it. And yet, you see, the the interesting problem here is one again of time and space. The time you occupy a certain amount of cubic inches of space versus the time and space occupied by somebody else at another point on the graph. Just as a big long line there. But nobody quite understands why we have this. No, they don't. They really don't. Now, a lot of people are going to come up with glib answers, but no one has really explained that one interesting facet of all of us. And that's this thing to know everything. To just see what it would do. You know? Just see what it would do. No one really knows about this. And if you're going to tell me, come up and say, well, they're doing this because, you know, if they find out how it is on Saturn, they will discover how they can better the lot on it. Oh, come on. Everybody wants to go to Saturn just to see what Saturn's like, that's all. Why don't we just admit it? We want to see what's there. Why do we have to come up with all this, you know, this jazz? Maybe they figured if we said the truth, no one would pay for it. But I suspect they would pay for it quicker if you laid it out, you know. They said, we want to shoot a rocket up, see how high we can shoot one up. Let's get the dough up here. We're going to shoot this big one up there as far as it can go. And I would pay. But if they come up, you know, and they want to tell me we want to find out about the cosmic rays and about the number of times the gamma ray bounces off the number 3 E'2 shield, you know, come on, lay off. I mean, after all, my life is short. I just want to see how high you can shoot it. I'm sorry, that's my attitude towards it, which is a terrible attitude, you know. I suppose I should have the proper 20th century attitude, which is the non-romantic or the academician attitude, where I could couch all my secret yearnings in very involved technical language, which, when all boiled down, says we want to shoot it up in the air. That's what it really boils down to. We want to find out. Of course, we explain we have gamma rays. We go into quantum mechanics. We go into the whole routine. You say to kind of hide the whole thing. It's like a giant speakeasy we're running of the mind. You know, that everybody pretends that everything else is going on, but what he really wants is a drink. That's all. I want a drink. We rationalize all over the place, and I'm. Of course, on the other hand, if people ever would admit why they have wars, for example, we might begin to make some progress towards not having them. You know, any good psychologist will tell you that the minute a man who has got a fixation, say, for example, an alcoholic, admits that he has one, really admits it, you know, I says, well, all right, now, where do we go from here? Then there might be a chance of going, but there's obviously no guarantee of a cure, but there is a chance. But we never admit this. Hardly, you can't get anybody hardly ever to admit that. Why? Oh, what do you mean? Go to war? We get a kick out of that, all that shooting, all that hollering on, all them fireworks, and people yelling and fist fighting, all that. You know? Is there one among you here who, if you saw a fist fight across the street, wouldn't be strangely drawn toward it? Huh? And don't come up and tell me, well, it's because, you know, you're against war now because you're afraid you're going to get hit in the eye. Oh, no, I don't think so either. I think it's how you get hit in the eye. Isn't there one among you who never to himself has said, you can see yourself charging up the hill there at San Juan Hill, you know, and Teddy Roosevelt's howling, charge, and you're running up there behind him, you know, and you take this ball through your shoulder, and you continue to struggle up there, carrying the flag aloft. Come on. You know it's true. You know, it's one of the saddest sights of all is this little 97-pound weakling standing on the library steps saying how much he hates football players. Does he really? Or does he hate non-football players even more? It's very complicated, you know. It gets why don't they turn them fans off on the BMT? Who's covering up, Wagner? Wise guy. I know how this works. Well, nobody's going to tell me how it works. I know how it works. They're not covering up. They're not telling you nothing.
You don't think they're going to tell you everything about what that thing is going to do when it gets up there, do you? Let me tell you, they're covering up. Who's covering? All them guys in Washington, everybody, the big shots. What about that match? You heard about that match that they invented? You light it once, and in fact, you can light it all the rest of your life. It's a match that lasts a lifetime. They bought that one up, boy, and stuck it away in a safe. You heard about that guy that invented the motor that runs on water? They bought that one up, stuck it away in a safe. They're not letting nothing out, them guys. Not giving you nothing. They're smart. How'd they make all their dough? How can they sell their gas? Huh. Yeah, they're wise guys. Let me tell you, 15 cents fare on a subway? Let me tell you, Jack, it's going to be 20 cents before the year is out. And why? Who's getting all that dough? Who's sticking all that dough in his pocket, huh? I'll do it tomorrow. Yes, I will. Well, you think not? You watch me. Now, this is a common attitude. You know the attitude? Is there anyone among you who hasn't heard about the carburetor that gets 40 miles to the gallon of gas? And they bought it up from this inventor? They bought it up? Yeah, I know. You got it in a safe. Speaking of the safes, boy, I'll tell you who's got a loaded one. You ought to drop by down to the Mandarin house. Wise apple. The Mandarin house on 13th Street between 6th and 7th. Who are they? Who are they? What do you mean, who are they? All them guys in Washington, the big guys, the big shots, guys with all the dough. Who are they? You know who they are. Mandarin house. Some of the best Chinese food in this whole man's eastern seaboard. And they're open every night. By George, till midnight. They are. They got everything down there. They got all the whole works there. They're open 7 days a week. What do you mean, who are they? You know who they are. Stop it. You're pushing again. They don't tell you nothing, Mac. Crying out loud. Keep your knees loose. Some nights it's awful, awful dark. You know, just remember that. Just remember that elephant foot. And from time to time, remind yourself of the man in the snake house. And maybe you'll understand.
This is
WBAI New York. Gene Shepard from February the 19th of 1962. That wraps up today's Mass Backwards. We'll be back next week, 3:30 to 6 a.m., with more music from the mid-1960s, from the original 45 monaural recordings, another Gene Shepard episode, another Dandelion Wine from Ray Bradbury, and perhaps a little fundraising. So do think about supporting WBAI as the fund drive kicks off Wednesday.
From February 21st, 1962, Chewing the Fat. The Mole People. Woe betide those of you who have nothing in their lives they couldn't talk about. A Fable of a Boarding House, and Other Fables of George Ade.
Now it's time for the Gene Shepard Show.
Do you ever have the feeling that it's all going to blow over? You know, it's all going to blow over. It's all going to be hotsy-totsy all the way in from here on out. You know, hunky-dory? I'm sorry if I'm using phrases which have little or no meaning to you. Does the phrase hunky-dory, does this relate only again to a Midwesternism? Hunky-dory? You've heard it before? Oh, you have? Well, that's good. You see, we Americans speak a common language, and it's different. Oh, yes, we do. Very common. Oh, exceedingly common. And the other night, when I was on the air, I said something to the effect of chewing the fat. This is, I'm afraid, is an expression that is an American expression. Since we're all Americans, we must understand each other. We must, grasp the hand in common distrust. Put your hand right out here, buddy, where I can see it. Here, I'm certainly glad to see you. I remember one time I used to do on the air. Did I ever tell you about that? Many, many eons ago. Oh, we're going to have things to answer for. Believe me, we're all going to have things to answer for when we get up before that great judge. There's going to be many things that are going to come out of that book that are going to look awful tough. Like, for example, me. I know there's one thing I'm going to have to talk about, and I'm going to have to explain. I used to do a program of recorded music called Bing Sings. And this was on a radio show, ancient times, way back in my Paleolithic days. I would come on and I would say, Bing Sings. Ba 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 bee, ba ba boo, ba 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 boo, ba ba boo, ba 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 bee, ba 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 boo, boo. And right at that point, see, I'd fade it down. I'd say, yes, Bing Sings, brought to you by Sam Pollock. Sam Pollock, the painless dentist who features plates with a smile. Ba 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 bee, ba ba boo. Ba ba boo 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 ba 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 bee. I'd fade it down. I'd say, friends, Bing will be with us in just a moment to sing Red Sails in the Sunset. But first, I'd like to ask you about your plates. Do your plates add to your personality? Do they give your face that wonderful warm look of a man who is smiling inwardly? Dr. Sam Pollock's plates with a smile are guaranteed to fit perfectly. Ba 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 bee, ba ba. Plates with a smile. I'm going to have to answer for that. Well, no, I honestly did. I did a show, and his slogan was Dr. Sam Pollock, the plates with a smile. And it's kind of, of course, you can't help but conjure up pictures of Scrooge sitting there wearing a pair of plates that smile. He's sitting there, the old wonderful We Trust You Forever Loan Company. And this man, I'll never forget one time I used to go to a bank when I was about 12 years old. And I'd go down there, and I was working. I was just a kid, and I was working for this grocery store on the weekends. And I'd come in once in a while at night, maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon sometimes when I had a half a day of school. And the guy would send me down to the bank to get pennies and nickels. And there was a man named Mr. Weatherby down there at the bank. It was one of these little banks. And Mr. Weatherby would look out at me from behind that thing, And of course, the bank was such an official thing with me when I was a kid that I never went into this thing other than just to go in and get pennies and stuff. Well, I remember Weatherby. Mr. Weatherby would look out at me, and he had plates, real plates. Do you know what I mean by real store teeth? The kind of store teeth. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. You can hear little springs and stuff go when he opens his mouth. And they have this gigantic, wonderful, brilliant, bright whiteness. And I used to associate Mr. Weatherby with my grandmother, who had store teeth but never would admit it. And I remember one time I'm walking down the street or something with my grandmother, and hanging out over the... They don't do this anymore, or did they ever do this in the East? Hanging out over the sidewalk was a gigantic sign, and the sign was in the shape of a pair of teeth. Really big teeth, and they're sort of half open, like they were just about to bite into a prune. These 2 old teeth were hanging there, and over it says painless or something. Something like that. And I said to my grandmother, of course, I didn't know that she never talked about stuff like this. I said, Grandma, is this where you got your teeth? Because they looked exactly like my grandmother's teeth hanging up there. And boy, there was this terrible moment.
And my mother, of course, later on. Of course, these things... And to get back, though, to our common language, putting it out there, you just put it right out here. Fine, you just put your hand right out here. You have come to the right place. Now, it's well known that in our world of the 20th century, that friendship has died. That no longer is there such a thing as a personal touch, brothers. No longer can one man say to another man, you are my friend and I trust you. No, we are living in the 20th century, friends. We are living in the time of hell and damnation. So I want you to put your hand right out and put it right here and grasp my hand in electronic friendship. I want you to come forward. I want you to put your hands on the top of that radio. Do you feel that warm? Do you feel that heat, that warmth coming up right there? Coming up through your knuckle bones, through your wrist bones, and up through your elbow bones? That's love. Put it there. You have come to the right place. Well, I'm talking about the other night. I'm discussing, chewing the fat. And so I figured that it was a Midwesternism, and I said, well, we've got this common American language anyway, at least that an American can pop up out of the trenches someplace and holler, hey, chew the fat, Mac. And every other American for miles would know that they're chewing the fat. Well, I get a letter from this Englishman. He says, yes, sir, I listened to the program the other night. I heard you mention what you call an Americanism, chew the fat. As far as I know, this expression has been used for countless generations, and as a matter of fact was one of my favorite expressions of my dear old Nanny, who used to refer to my now sainted mother as a prime fat chewer. My mother was a chewer of the fat. Thank you, Sir Geoffrey Chaucer Rhodes. One of the very few times I've ever gotten a letter from a sir. I put it there. You've come to the right place, oh, friend. So give me, please, once upon a time, as we beat the drum of perdition. The Wilmington Supreme Court has upheld a divorce given a man whose wife, by the evidence, constantly incited their boxer dog to bite him. On at least 3 occasions, as a result of dog bites, the husband required medical treatment, said the justice who wrote the opinion, handed down Friday. The case reached the high tribunal on an appeal by the wife from a Supreme Court granted divorce to the husband, Leighton, on the grounds of extreme cruelty. The family lives in nearby Newark. He is a chemist and in his 40s. The opinion described him as a man of almost superhuman forbearance. The judge said that on various other occasions the wife ripped off her husband's clothes, choked him with his own necktie, kicked him, leaving lasting scars, struck him with an electric fan, threatened him with a butcher knife, hit him without warning while in bed, threw hot coffee on him, went after him with a handsaw, and threatened to hit him with an electric iron, a milk bottle, and a hammer. Beside that, the justice went on to enumerate, she heaped wordy abuse on the husband, calling him insulting names and mocking his baldness and his hearing aid. The two were married for 10 years. The husband had 2 daughters by his first marriage. The elder one left home, the justice said, because she no longer could endure her stepmother's, quote, unreasonable discipline and also physical punishment. The court's opinion said that the breakup came when the wife slapped the younger daughter, and the dog, always on the wife's side, leaped at the girl. The husband went to the daughter's assistance, and in the ensuing melee was himself attacked by the dog. He said he had to pry the dog's jaws open from where he had been bitten. The wife's lawyer argued that extreme cruelty hadn't been proven because the husband, quote, was not in fear of his life. The justice concluded, it is obvious that this was not a happy home and that at least these parties were incompatible. Chew the fat, indeed. Now, it's obvious to me that these are mole people. I have come to the conclusion that there is a whole population of us who are not recorded in fiction, who are not written about, who are not moaned over nor discussed, and in fact, in some ways, are not even worthy of it. Mole people. Are you aware that among us there walks, if that phrase covers their means of locomotion, a population of mole people whose passions, if they can be called that, burn like a low flame on an ancient stove, barely flickering, barely sputtering, a tiny, almost extinguished spark of the divine flame of existence and life. And who, when in the heat of what, for want of a better word, we can call their most flaming passion, are barely seen to move. The mole people. You know what I mean by the mole people? The people who really are not capable of emotion, real emotion. Well, they can get irritated when they're pushed in bush lines and things like that, or when there's a busy signal on the telephone. They get irritated over the wrong things. But the mole people, well, there they are. You wonder even how they reproduce their kind. Oh, speaking of mole people, this is WOR AM and FM New York. And
this is WBAI New York.
Till 12 midnight. This is the 40th year of WOR. Do you realize that? You know, you hear him talking on the air about it. And I don't know whether you know anything about that or what that means to you, but do you realize that I just did that 40 years is almost 40 years in the radio business is like 25 light years in any other industry. It really is. And what's really scary about it is that there are some people around here who were here very shortly after the sputtering flame was breathed into the final triodes of the final amplifier of WOR when she began to put out a 260-watt signal. Lo, these many eons ago, there are some guys who are still here. How's that for a rut? Yeah, well, you know that Thomas Edison was our morning man. A long time ago. Did you see the picture of him standing down there by the microphone? Huh? Yeah, he came on there. That's true. Well, how do you think John Gambling got his job? He had plenty of friends. Yeah, well, that's right. Well, Al, wasn't Edison one of the early engineers? Or was he doing the exercise show here in the morning? We'll be here until midnight. I know all about it. I've heard. It's funny business. The mole people. I'll tell you what the danger of the mole people is. You know what is it, the mole people? These are people who are not really interested in and can't find it within their scope to become engaged in life. You know, who can't reach out and grab the handles. And these are the people who are the quickest people to want to go to war. These are the people who love the idea of war and all the rest of the things that make up for a kind of artificial excitement and stimuli, which they would never get out of existence. You know what I mean by that? It's the little mole people. Did you ever read the story of Heinrich, what is it? Wasn't his first name Heinrich Himmler? Was it Heinrich Himmler? You ever read the story of Himmler? The life story of Himmler before Hitler came along and before the war started. The war was nothing. The war was made for this guy. I mean, it was his moment of absolute glory. There was nothing else for him. And boy, what scares me is that great horde of people who sit in the subways, and the only movement that you see stirring in their soul is when somebody steals their seat. That's the only time they have any excitement during the day, or when they hit their wife in the mouth. You know? That's the truth. There's a whole population of them, and it always baffles me to find writers and people, and well-meaning people, you know, who march around with signs. who because of the fact that they are so involved in life that they will march with signs, they don't seem to be able to understand the great mass of the population of people who are just moles, who are just waiting for something, just waiting for somebody to hit. And the moment that somebody shows up, that's the moment they live. Let me tell you, I knew one man, a mole. By the way, where the mole person, one of the places where mole people find their greatest expression is in the world of the engineers. The world of the people who live by figures and facts. And I remember one time having an engineer who worked with me. And at any given moment, when you could let him get on to the subject, he would tell you about the time he got in a fight in a cafeteria. He loved that story. He'd say, did I ever tell you about the time I was over in Wolford's cafeteria? I'm in line there, and all of a sudden this wise guy comes up behind me, and he starts jabbing me in the elbow. I turned around. I said, quit pushing me, I didn't want any trouble. The guy says, mind your own business, Mac. Well, I said, what do you mean, mind your own business? I'm just going through here, just picking up some pie. And the next thing I know, the guy's pushing around. He wants to fight. Well, I'll tell you what I did. I just let him have it, man. Within 30 seconds, that guy spread out there under the... Oh, yeah. Well, of course, it was his big moment. Speaking of the mole people, did you read the aftermath of the guy that broke the snake cages? Did you read about... Hey, come on, watch it here, boy. This is worse than Ellen. Did you hear the aftermath of the snake guy last week? You want to hear about it? You remember the guy that went through and busted up this... They caught him. They caught this guy. Police today held a man who admitted smashing 46 cages, which held poisonous snakes in the St. Louis Zoo. Friday, watchmen at the zoo reported a man tore a screen off the reptile house, ripped off the brass retaining bar, and plunged for the building, smashing cages. Police said when he was picked up, I get worked up once in a while. He was found sleeping on a sidewalk on the north side of Chicago. Yeah. One of the great mass of the unrecorded. Well, look, man, I get worked up too once in a while. Somehow, you and I have something in common. And I'm not quite sure what it is. I'm not quite sure what it is. It's like George Ade said when talking about the great mass of mole people. Once there was a home-like beanery where one could tell the day of the week by what was on the table. The stroke oar of this food bazaar had been in the business for 20 years, and she never had earned her harp. In fact, she'd taken it home 3 times over. The prune joke never touched her. And she had herself trained so as not to hear any sarcastic cracks about the oleo. She prided herself on the atmosphere of culture that permeated the establishment, and on the fact that she did not harbor any improper characters. A good many improper characters came around and sized up the layout, and then blew. It was a sure enough boarding house, such as many of our best people know all about, even if they don't tell. The landlady was doing what she could to discourage the beef trust, but she carried a heavy line of oatmeal. She had oatmeal to burn, and sometimes did. And she often remarked that spinach had iron in it and was great for the blood. One of her pet theories was that rice contained more nutriment than could be found in spring chicken. But the boarders allowed that she had never seen a spring chicken. In the cast of characters were many old favorites. There was the lippy boy with the Williams and Walker shirts, who knew the names of all the ball players and could tell when there was a good variety show in town. Then there was the other kind. Hold it. This is one of the most beautiful descriptions in all of English literature of a true mole person. Listen carefully. The reason I'm reading this magnificent little George Ade fable is because of his description of people who are never described in literature, in drama, who are never carved into frescoes, who never decorate mosaics. Then there was the other kind. with a straw-colored mustache and a prominent Adam's apple who was very careful about his pronunciation. He belonged to a social purity club that had a yell. His idea of a big hurrah was to get in a parlor with a few sisters who were under the age limit and sing the bass part of Pull for the Shore. And then there was the old boarder. He was the landmark. Having lived in boarding houses and hotels all his life, he had developed a gloom that surrounded him like a morning fog. He had a way of turning things over on his fork, as if to say, well, don't know about this. And he never believed anything he saw in the papers. He said the papers printed them things just to fill up. And the Circassian princes that brought in the victuals paid more attention to him than to anyone else. Because if he didn't get egg on his lettuce, he was liable to cry all over the tablecloth. Then there was the chubby man who came in every evening and told what had happened at the store that day. And there was the human anteater who made puns. One of the necessary features of a refined joint is the slender thing who likes music and is taking lessons on the piano, and is usually the daughter of the establishment. This boarding house had one of those mother and child combinations that was a dream. Daughter was full of Kubelik and Joseph Hoffman. Away back in the pines somewhere there was a father who was putting up for the outfit. She was a consistent little booster. Mother's job was just to boost and sit around and root. If what Mother said was true, then Effie's voice was a good deal better than it sounded. She said the teachers were just crazy about it, and all of them agreed that Effie ought to go to Paris or Milan and learn to study opera. The slangy boy with the ragtime shirt went them one better. He said all the phony Melbas in the country ought to pull for the old country and wait till they were sent for. At this same boarding house, there was a widow whose husband had neglected to die. Being left all alone in the world, she had gone out to make her way, since which time she had gained about 30 pounds and was considered great company by the young man. Necessarily, there was a pale lady who loved to read and who stuck to the patterns that appeared in the ladies' magazines. Then there was the married couple, without any furniture or children of their own. And the only reason they didn't take a house was that Henry had to be out of town so often. Henry's salary had been whooped $500 a year, and she was just beginning to say gown instead of dress. She had the society column for breakfast, and things looked dark for Henry. For many months, this conventional group of ordinary size 6 7/8 mortals had lived in a rut. At each mealtime, they rounded up and mechanically devoured what was doled out to them and folded their napkins and broke ranks. Each day was the duplicate of the one before it, and life had petered down to a routine. One evening, just as they had come in for their vermicelli, a new boarder glided into their ranks. She was a tall gypsy queen with about $12,000 worth of clothes that fit her everywhere and all the time. And she had this watch me kind of walk. The same being a cue for all the other girls to get out their hardware. When she moved up to the table and began to distribute a few sample smiles so as to indicate the character of her work, the musical team went out with the tide. The grass widow curled up like an autumn leaf. The touch-me-not-married lady dropped into the scrub division. The lady who read was shy a spoon and was afraid to ask for it. The men were all goggle-eyed, and the help was running into chairs and dropping important parts of the menu on the floor. Presently, the landlady came in and explained. She said that Mrs. Williams was in the city to shop for a couple of days, and that her husband would be up on the night train. Whereupon 5 men quietly slid under the table. The moral: nothing ever happens in a boarding house, or anywhere else for that matter. is there anything on the log for me there? Check with Jack. Got a check here. If there is such a thing as, I suppose you might call a theme, we are taking tonight, brother, as our text, we are taking tonight the existence among us of the mole people and the danger pertaining thereto. Now, I'm quite convinced that hardly anybody who is a mole people knows he is. And yet I'm also equally convinced that there isn't a single one of us walking around today who doesn't suspect that he himself isn't a mole people. I mean, who he himself doesn't feel. Have you ever had the feeling that somehow the blossoms blossomier, or somehow the pulse beats harder? Have you ever really wondered about the lives of other people? Actually? Really wondered about it? I mean, about the real things. You know the kind of stuff you never talk about? The stuff you never discuss with anybody? Have you ever wondered about this side of other people? Or do you pretend that it doesn't exist with those other people? I can already hear the letter now. See, because when these letters come in, you hear them, Dad. They just lay there on the desk and holler, "Dear Mr. Shepard, I have no idea what you're talking about. And as far as the part of my life that I do not discuss, there is nothing in my life that I am not afraid to discuss. And as a matter of fact, I was telling Charles the other day, get rid of that idiot on the radio. What's he talking about? Get some nice music. I'm a John Gambling fan, and I like good things. Signed, an indignant ex-WOR listener." Yes, that's true, baby. I'm afraid that is true. Woe betide to those who have nothing in their lives that they couldn't talk about. Oh, but when you sit there in the bus, and there was a very funny little odd moment happened today. It was a very... No, it isn't an odd moment. There is a kind of secret communication that exists between people. I think it's between people... I don't know. I guess I don't know what the reverse of the mole people would be called. I suppose, measuring us with what is available, I suppose the reverse of the mole people, or the obverse, I suppose you could say, of the mole people, are the ant people. Most of us are ant people. And then on the other hand, I'm inclined sometimes to say most of us are mole people. Once in a while, stalking among the ants and over the moles comes the giant who could roughly be called a grasshopper person. Once in a while jumps up in the air, I mean, as compared to the tigers we could be. I mean, we could really be tigers. I mean, do you realize what we've got the world by right now at this point? Mankind? You know what it is we got the world by. I don't have to tell you. Oh, yeah. But we're gonna fool around, and the next thing you know, guess what's going to have us by? You know what? Yeah. Just because we're fooling around. We're standing around scratching, hollering. Okay, you shove that, and I'll shove back. The next thing you know, the principal's going to come out, and we're all going to be up. Well, you know about the creek. You've been there. And believe me, Dad, there ain't going to be no Abercrombie and Fitch at the other end selling paddles. I can tell you that. Okay? All right, are we on the same wavelength here? We understand each other? All right. Then what is it? It's up to my bloomin' knickers, already. And we are just in the shallows. Wait till we get out there where where the rapids start. Sometimes I have a feeling... I'm in this little canoe, speaking of little canoes. I have a favorite little canoe in my mind that keeps popping up. It's a little canoe that my grandmother had. It was a little phony birch bark canoe. A little tiny one, you know. It fascinated me when I was about 6. A little birch bark canoe, and the ends of it were stitched with red imitation leather, you know, stitches around it. And there was this little phony Indian sitting there, and he had this little paddle. He had a paddle, which is more than I can say for most of us. But he was the same place, you know. His paddle never touched whatever it was he was trying to row in. He was holding it up there at high port. And he was looking out over the, and underneath it said Hiawatha. Hiawatha. Souvenir of Alden, Illinois. Souvenir of Alden, Illinois. As far as I know, Hiawatha didn't come within 1,000 miles of Alden, Illinois, but that didn't stop the citizens of Alden, Illinois with associating themselves with greatness. So I used to look at that little canoe there, and that little canoe was on the library table. You know what is a library table? To my knowledge, a book never entered my grandmother's house, including even a Bible. In fact, she even objected to the Chicago phone book come in there. She didn't believe in reading. Said reading hurts your eyes. Not only did it hurt your eyes, put funny ideas in your head. Sometimes I have a feeling like I'm putting funny ideas into your head out there. I don't want to put no funny ideas into your head. And so I'd come there and I'd look over the top of that library table, which was covered with a Paisley shawl. Paisley being the name of the woman who sold shawls in the neighborhood, Emma L. Paisley. Large, heavy-set woman who wore squeaky shoes. Health shoes, you know. You know, the kind that strapped in the back and had buckles in the front and had 3 low heels on each foot. You know the kind of woman who at the age of 7 was already nursing mankind. She made Paisley shawls. Have you ever wondered how the name came to be Paisley? Did they call him Paisley out here? It was from Emma Paisley. She worked with Easter egg coloring. Produced a terrible shawl, but she meant well. And right in the middle of this library table was this Indian. And by the way, on the other end of the Paisley shawl was another Indian. Dyed right into the Paisley shawl, and this one said Souvenir of Kankakee, Illinois. Big for Indians around there. I used to watch those Indian pictures. And in my grandmother's bedroom, there was a picture of an Indian. The only picture she had in their house, outside of a picture of a waterfall that hung over the top of a calendar. And this picture, now, I may be wrong, it just seemed to me in my childish imagination that there was such a picture, although I can't comprehend the picture being painted of this kind. There was an Indian, and he was sitting on a horse, and he was looking down kind of depressed-like a fuller brush man at the end of the long trail. You could see the sunset or the sunrise, was hard to tell which, because these pictures were of a peculiar coloration. And underneath it said, the end of the trail. And it hung over my grandmother's bed and my grandfather's bed. These two people who came, certainly not from Chicago, but who had lived all their lives on that long sandy sward overlooking that great lake that hung down there like a gigantic grape, hanging there on the bottom end of Canada. Somehow they got hooked on Indians. Well, being a kid, I got hooked on canoes. And it's funny thing. One day I came in to see our boss here, and I said, "Boss, it's about time, don't you think so?" He knew what I meant. It was, he knew what I meant. I was kind of nudging him. It's about time, And he looked at me and he said, "Don't push your luck." Oh, I said, "Come on, Bob, come on. For crying out loud. What's gambling got that I haven't got?" Just one more crack out of you, and you are going to have to start hunting for a paddle. And immediately I see this little birch bark canoe. And funny thing about it, the cockles of my heart warmed, and because, I'm a sentimental cuss. You know me. Sentimental old cuss. He and I have been just like that ever since. I don't talk much about it anymore. But I'll tell you what I do keep behind my desk. I keep this small folding paddle. Because you never know when all of a sudden the floodgates are going to open. Are you still out there? Oh, mole people. Oh, ant one. Oh, grasshopper. Which beest thou, though, thee thou dost them? In thy travail? How is it out there in the vineyards tonight, huh? I'm sitting in the bus. Like I say, there's a kind of... there must be a communication between the ants. As I'm perfectly aware, there is a communication between the moles. And there must even be communication between the grasshoppers. Although I can but stand and admire the grasshopper from afar. You're the one that said it, not me. I'm sitting down the bus tonight. Snow is swirling down. Oh, it's a great night, by the way. The snow is swirling down around that bus. And I'm sitting there. And there was this person looking out of the window. And he's looking out. Just a guy. Ordinary sort of lout-looking type. He's looking up, and I can see he's digging. You know? He's looking out at 6th Avenue there, and he's somehow it's there. I'm looking down the aisle, and I'm digging the scene, too. He looks over at me, shrugs. I shrug. I never saw this guy in my life. He turns back, looks out of the window, and continues to dig. Reading the Chinese restaurant signs as the bus moved. Once in a while, picking up a big sign. My favorite sign on 6th Avenue is a big sign that has a big neon hand. Just a great big neon palm. And it says underneath it, in doubt about your future? Tea readings free. Luncheon served. Big neon palm on the 2nd floor. And above it is an enormous sign. It says, for the truth, for hard-hitting news, it's Channel 2 every time. So once in a while we drive past there, on the bus, and I get reassured. And so this guy's looking out the window there, and I'm waiting to see if he digs this. And sure enough, he looks up there, and he just sort of digs, That's the end of it. End of story. Are there any ants out there? I'd like to hear from an ant. Well, one thing about grasshoppers, though, is that I suspect about... of course, I have to admit then probably I'm a grasshopper most of the time, because I think this about grasshoppers. They're too busy jumping around and hollering to really communicate. You see, the mole, because of his moleness, has instant communication with other moles. Even though the communication is on such a deep primal level that the only time he feels warm is when he is marching over some sad, heroic cliff together with all the other moles. Then he knoweth. Oh, speaking of knowing, I got this here little thing I like to show you here, if you don't mind. It was once said by George Ade, who said it better than most people ever do. Yes. Well, I don't know whether I should bring it up. There's sometimes you figure you better not say it, see? Because, well, it can get dangerous. Well, all right, I'll say it. No, I better not. I can tell you that the moral to the fable, maybe I better not tell you the fable. You can build the fable yourself. The moral to the fable is the reaction is something terrible. Hold it. How do you like this for a name of a fable? Speaking of the ants. Interesting. The patient toiler who got it in the usual place. Once there was an office employee with a copybook education. He believed it was his duty to learn to labor and to wait. He read pamphlets and magazine articles on success and how to make it a cinch. He knew that if he made no changes and never beefed for more salary, but just buckled down and put in extra time and pulled for the house, he would arrive in time. The faithful worker wanted to be department manager. The hours were short, the salary large, and the work easy. He plugged on for many moons, keeping his eye on that roll-top desk, for the manager was getting into the has-been division, and he knew there must be a vacancy soon. At last, the house gave the old manager the privilege of retiring and living on whatever pittance he had saved. Ah, this is where humble merit gets its reward, said the patient toiler. I can see myself now counting money. That very day, the Maine Gazooks led into the office one of the handsomest tennis players that ever worked on Long Island and introduced him all around as the new department manager. I shall expect you to tell Archibald all about the business, said the Maine Gazooks to our patient toiler. You see, he has just graduated from Yale, and he doesn't know a thing about managing anything except a catboat, and his father is one of our principal stockholders, and he is engaged to a young woman whose uncle is the head of the trust. I had been hoping to get this job for myself, said the faithful worker faintly. You are so valuable as a subordinate and have shown such an aptitude for detail work that it would be a shame to waste you on a big job, said the Maine Gazooks. Besides, you are not equipped. You have not been to Yale. Your father is not a stockbroker. You are not engaged to a trust. Get back to your high stool, and whatever Archibald wants to know, you tell him. Moral: one who wishes to be a figurehead should not overtrain.
From February 22, 1962, Shepard almost sells out. The Plan a Prayer System. I am an American cards. Ogg and Charlie are sitting by the shore of a lake, when Charlie's knee starts to bend. A doomed romance. Part of the opening theme has been deleted.
Well, things are getting interesting. Things are getting interesting in many areas. And I feel, by way of theme, let us say, that we introduce... I don't... There's no sense, really, in being formal about it, is there really? Let's just sit here and... Well, I happen to be in a position which is a kind of... I suppose you might say an ambiguous position. It's difficult to know how these things happen, but I am constantly being bombarded by great collections every day of junk mail.
Well, we call it junk mail, of course, you know, the terminology referring to junk mail.
But actually, I don't call it junk mail. I think it's the most significant mail. Because the junk mail really lays it on a line. I mean, it doesn't fool around. Now, I hope I didn't confuse you by using the expression lays it on the line. I understand this was purely an Indiana expression and one which is hardly ever heard out here on the eastern seaboard. Laying it on the line means laying it on the line. Okay? Well, I get this piece of junk mail the other day, and it contains one of the most interesting propositions I've seen in a long time. Now, the only reason I'm bringing these things to you is because I am perfectly aware that... I'd say almost all of the people, the percentage of people who are not involved in daily brouhaha, hullabaloo, pursuit of whatever it is that makes it possible to buy a new breezeway next year, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, ad infinitum, ad nauseum, you know, the whole jazz, the rigmarole, the brouhaha, the hoopla. Well, most people are involved in that, you see. Well, by a lot of tricks of fate and inclination, and probably even inheritance, I find myself not really involved in that. And so I am and have been enabled by the very nature of the slot into which I have fallen. I have been able to examine minutely millions of things which most people, if they even see them at all, don't have the time to fool with. They just throw it aside. They don't go into it, you know? You know what I mean by this? This is the row, I suppose you might call it loosely, of the gadfly. Just fools around, you know, hollers. Sits in the bushes and watches the stuff go by and shouts. You see, well, the thing about the non-gadfly, I can see this, is that he is involved. I mean, he's walking along the trail, you know? It's like a great big wagon train there, and they're all flubbing along there, and somebody's out there in the bushes who's not really part of the train. Somehow he got off somewhere along the line, and he's valuable because once in a while he sees the Indians coming, you know? He's like, Indians! And everybody else is all busy hitting the horses and you know, and fooling around with the water and stuff. And he keeps on, Indians, here they come! Oh! Well, that's the job. Now, it's a very important job, albeit, I can say, very unpopular, particularly if you happen to be an Indian. Very unpopular. And also, it's very unpopular to the guys in the wagon train because half of them are asleep. It's easy to be there, you know, asleep and fooling around with the oats and stuff. And this guy keeps hollering, oh, it's no good. Look at what's happening. It's starting to rain. It's coming down. Hey, get up the tops. Look out. Well, he's unpopular on both sides. No question about it. Now, I have every reason to believe. Have you noticed, for example, WOR has taken the position here. They've been celebrating their 40th. I say they because I really don't feel part of it. They've been celebrating their 40th anniversary. And it's like one little big happy family, you know, with all of the Eastern Seaboard all going back through memory lane with Pegeen and Albert and Dora and Dorothy and Dick and all. I notice they don't mention Dorothy and Dick, too, in this card. They're not part of the family either. No, they're not, really. And it's a funny thing, even though they've been here longer than most, strangely enough, they've never become part of the family. Nor has Long John. I hope you know that. Nor have I. Hope you know that. That's right. Yeah, and so when these people are all talking about how wonderful and how warm it is to be part of the family, and they're talking about, yes, you have your favorites, your old favorites. There's John B. Gambling, John L. Gambling, John G. Gambling, John G. L. D. Gambling, John Gambling the Third. There's all the Gamblings, and then there's Dora and Albert and little Patty and all the families and all the families. They never mention me. They really don't. Nor do they mention John, nor Dorothy and Dick. And that's true. So we're this way, you see. It's just like I'm out in the bushes. So now my value to you is it depends on whether you're an Indian. Again, I must say that. It also depends on whether you're half asleep at the switch there and you're just fooling around with the oats. Now, I see the thing that I feel is a profound sense of, and this has always been the position of whatever passes for the artist at any given time, he has a terrible desire to become either an Indian or an oat dealer on the top of the way. No, that's true. You can't help but want to be either driving a wagon there, half asleep in the sun, with 87 kids in the back there in the wagon and just fooling around and sleeping away there. This is must be great. That's all I can say. It's great. Then on the other hand, the Indians seem to have something on the ball too. You know, they've got a real position. They're identified. They're Indians. I mean, they're Indians. They're coming charging out of the hills. And the guy in the wagon, he's got the thing too. He's a slob, so he's identified. Okay, now what is the guy who's skulking in the bushes who keeps hollering, hey, the Indians are coming? He's not on the wagon. He secretly wants to be. Somehow he didn't make the train when they started, and, one thing and another. And on the other hand, he doesn't really feel as angry about the Indians as the other people because he can see their side too, He never made it. So you got this ambivalent problem. Now I'm going to put it up to you. If you want me to become an Indian, I can easily become an Indian. As a matter of fact, that's one of the most difficult problems of all of the person who's in the bushes. He has the tendency to listen to both sides. That's true. And this can be very, very unpopular in our time. It can be a terrible thing to have to admit that the Indian has a point, and I'm using the Indian purely as an allegorical Indian here. It's very difficult. And on the other hand, I can admit the guy sitting in the wagon there, asleep in the sun, he's got his point. Who doesn't want to, flub along there with a wagon full of stuff, with all the dough in the world and the sun coming down? I mean, why shouldn't? Who doesn't want to be this? So you're very difficult problem to be in the bushes here. You want to be one or the other. Now, I'm going to I shouldn't really do this. I'll put it up to you. Do you want me to become a wagon driver here? Or do you want me to become an Indian? Or do you want me to stay in the bushes? It's up to you. No, it isn't up to you. What are you talking about? Stop it, Shepherd. It's not up to you. It is not up to you. I don't care what you think. Crying out loud. What am I doing here? Whew, boy. I was just about to sell out. Do you realize that within 30 seconds I'd have sold out? Well, now, look, it's easy to sell out, and I almost did there. I want one guy to call up and say, Shepherd, that was a close one. I just want to hear that you're with me out there. Oh, pretty quiet. Well, getting back to the junk mail, you see, I'm looking at all this junk mail, and I get one here the other day that I thought is deserving of notion and mention. It tells about this device, you see. It's for people who are really Americans. Again, they're the wagon drivers, you know, who really are wagon drivers, who really have a load full of oats there, and the whiskey in the back there, and the whole business in the wagon. And it's for these real Americans. And the ad said this: Dear American, so do you have trouble from time to time answering what you really believe in? Do you have trouble when people confront you with a question of ideological nature about being an American? Do you have difficulty studying involved books on political philosophy? Well, we have what we call the new plant a prayer system. And yet you go to bed, you see, if you're a real American, you stick this thing under your pillow and you turn on the tape, and it says things to you in your sleep. And I kind of like this thing. You see, while you sleep, it says it. You're an American. You're a great person. Americans are the greatest people in the world. You are a right thinker. Hooray for Barry Goldwater. Hooray for Barry Goldwater. Hooray for Edwin Walker. You are a right thinker. You are conservative. Above all things, you believe in the individual. Do you understand? And to believe in the individual is to believe in the American way of life, and to believe in the American way of life is to make dough. Who can argue that? Down with Social Security. Repeat it over and over to yourself, and do not allow thyself to be... Repeat this prayer after me. Oh, in all things, I will think right. I will believe in all things good and true and clean. I will never be subverted from right thinking. I am an American. Da dee 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 da do 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 do. Dee 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 dee. The Democrats are unknowing dupes. Dee 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 dee. They are the dupes of the blind monolithic forces of atheism. End of tape. Please turn over in your sleep. You will now sleep soundly. You will sleep the sleep of the just and the righteous. You know what you stand for. Gee, it's an interesting tape, wasn't it? I mean, that sets the record straight. Speaking of setting the record straight, this is poor old 40-year-old WOR, AM, FM, all the rest of it here in the Big Onion, and we'll be here until 12 midnight. Somehow I can't help but feel a great compassion for people who know so little about what they believe in and how they feel and what they are, that they have to play a tape stuck under their pillow to keep reminding them and somehow implant it in them in their sleep. And then in the next page of this junk mail is this magnificent little item here. I think this calls for yes, just a little soups on there. Now available, I Am a Card-Carrying American cards with flag and Pledge of Allegiance in gold script. All together now.
Down to get you in a taxi, honey. You better be ready about 8:30. Now, baby, don't be late. I want to be right there when the band starts playing. Remember when we get there, honey, the 2 steps, I'm gonna have them on. Gonna wear out both my shoes when they play them Jelly Roll Blues. How tomorrow night at the dark time cut us off.
And then there was this little one ad that came through in this piece of junk mail. This little classified ad that said, Ultra Spartan, conservative, ascetic, slaves to work, duty, and far future, 1/2 rich associates wanted. No investment. Protect your business from pilfering by your dishonest employees. That tells more about it than anything I know of. Well, it's pretty hard, you know, to tell. Because everybody has the right answers and everyone has learned the right things to say. Whether it be about calendar art, or whether it be about the kind of gasoline you should burn in your car, or whether it's about cigars, or whether it's about sex, or whether it's about bees' knees. Everyone has the right things to say. No question about it. But you know, it's a funny thing. Most of the things that are really happening among us, the real things that are not theoretical, but that are right there in front of us, are hardly ever discussed, and in fact, they're hardly ever touched upon. Only rarely do we recognize them for what they are. I remember one time when I was a kid, you know, you pick these things up, and I guess this is how you kind of get to be, I suppose, the guy in the bushes. This is one little example of it. I suppose the people who are riding the horses, if they're Indians, are deeply involved in Indianism. I mean, no other thing. This is what they're involved in. The guys who are sitting on the front end of the wagon are deeply involved in wagon sitting. And so, hence, nothing else seems to be able to get in. But then if you're not involved, if you're sitting out there in the bushes, you're in a completely different situation. I believe the difference is this, that those who are on one side of the fence completely believe everything that's said about that side of the fence and never question it, no matter what side of the fence it is. Must be wonderful to have an unquestioning attitude about yourself. It must be wonderful, and I imagine this is one of the reasons why, well, of course, it's not a matter of imagining. It is undoubtedly one of the reasons why there has been, ever since the very first 2 or 3 guys sat on the banks of this antediluvian lake, there has always been some sort of strong dogma that has filtered through the mind of man. Because if you can get dogma strong enough, of any kind, it removes all elements of self-doubt. In fact, self-doubt just doesn't exist. It's just not there. That's what the whole idea of dogma is. And so, if there are 2 guys, it must have been interesting to sit there. In fact, I have this friend, the University of Pennsylvania, who's a famous anthropologist, an archaeologist, and he was trying to put it together a couple of years ago, how it must have happened. And they have a few little stones and rocks around that are left over about these 2 guys sitting on the shore of this lake. One guy's named Ogg, and the other was named Charles. And they were sitting there, and once in a while they'd get down and bust up a clam or 2. And then one day, it became quite apparent to Ogg that his left knee was hurting. It's funny how there was a time in man's history when he was not even aware of the passage of time. Are you aware of that? Time seems so natural to us now that we can't comprehend anyone not knowing that time didn't pass. But there was a time when they didn't know about this thing of time. You know that? They didn't recognize it. And are you aware that they can almost pinpoint historically when the concept of time became a part of the sum of human knowledge or myth? Oh, yes. Well, how? You mean how do they pinpoint it? Well, that's very complicated, but there is a time, when this came into the knowledge of mankind. How? Well, it began to develop about the time that man was a little later, actually, when man began to develop techniques for what you might call abstract communication, writing. Writing is an abstract form of communication. It is a symbol for the word. And at about that time, a little bit later, it began to creep into the various things that were left around, that men were beginning to be aware that there was such a thing as time. Now, their concept of time was very different from our concept of time now. And I'm not even just merely recognizing the fact that we measure it differently. But their idea of what it was a very different thing. And so these 2 guys are sitting there, and one of them is having trouble with his knee. Little recognizing the fact, or even understanding it, or even knowing that the trouble with his knee was that he was over the hill. His knee had never hurt before. And since, as he stood up to go down to the lake to pick up some clams, his left knee gave him trouble. And he limps down there, and he limps back with the clams, squats down. Now, we ourselves would say, well, he's getting old, because we recognize time. But they didn't have that out then, you see. All they knew was that something was happening that hadn't happened before, and it was a worrisome thing that could easily lead you to sing the blues of the night there on the shore of that antediluvian lake as you crack your clams. Well, Charles, being the first wise guy, and incidentally, that is pinpointed historically, that up to that point, there were no such thing as wise guys, but this was the first one. He later has, of course, the wise guy. Now, I'm using it in its a classical sense. Wise man. Wise guy. Capital letters, wise. The one with all the answers. Now, if you believe in what he says, he is a wise man. If you don't believe in what he says, he's a wise guy. You see, but the shade of difference is very subtle. Very, very subtle. And so this wise guy / wise man looked at Ogg and said, there's a reason. And he said, a reason? My knee, it hurt. He says, there is a reason. The whole concept of reason hadn't come into being yet. So you see, Charles was a groundbreaker, an icebreaker in many areas. This is also typical of wise guy and or / wise man. He says, reason. The reason is because last night, the white owl on the fir tree hooted twice. He did? He says, yes, every time white owl on fir tree hoots twice, trouble with knee. That answered it then. He says, always this way? Always. Well, sure enough, the next day, he had trouble with his knee, which was natural. But because he was a sound sleeper, he couldn't stay up to see whether the white owl hooted or not. However, oddly enough, and coincidentally, guess who was there listening? Right. And so, next day, I got trouble with knee. He says, my knee hurts. True, said Charles. White owl hoot twice last night. Oh. And that was the beginning of dogma. Right there. And so it became axiomatic that every time the white owl hoots twice, problem with knee. And you see, it removed doubt. And somehow Ogg felt better about it. His knee had a reason for hurting. And furthermore, it became very comforting to know that you could foretell knee hurting. And then the next week, after this week of hurting with the knee, Ogg got tired of it. Says, my knee is hurting. What can we do about this? Charlie says, there is a cure. So what is the cure? The cure is bring 700 clams to this point by high sunup, and I will speak with the white owl. Well, there it was starting there. It's downhill ever since. Just thought you ought to know. So, no, it wasn't payola. No, it was the first tribute. It's not payola, it's tribute. Of course, tribute is also payola, but payola came later. See, if you don't like what people are doing, it's called payola. If you like what they're doing, it's called a contribution. It's the very big difference there. We got to understand that language plays a great part in the symbolic life of man. Okay? Understand that? Well, I'm this kid now. Here's how you get yourself thrown out into the brambles if you don't watch it. Oh, yes. I'm this kid, and I'm sitting around the house, and at the time my father was working in an office. And he had all these people with him there. And occasionally they would come home to dinner. And, of course, the people from where my father worked, from the office. Now, I'm sure that only a kid who's listening to me would understand this. The adults don't remember it. But the people who work in your father's office have a very special place in your world. Oh, yes, a very special place. They're really sort of important. They're kind of extensions of your father. Do you know what I mean? They're important people. They're kind of celebrities. And they're rock-like. It's a very difficult relationship of a kid to the people who work with his father. It's very, very difficult. But they used to come around once in a while, and there was always a special and a very secret thing that went on between my father and those people. It was the office thing, which was never really brought home, except near the end of the month when there would be ledgers spread out all over the dining room table, and my father would work on them with blue ink. And he would get mad and stay up till 4 o'clock in the morning and yell and throw long streamers of paper, that had numbers on it from the adding machines around and stuff like that, and swear and stuff. And one time he spilt the India ink on the lace tablecloth, and to this day it remains there. Well, this is all part of that world of the office. And once in a while I would be taken down there, and this was a big deal, to go down to the office, and they had all these cages. And there was a true office smell, the smell of rubber stamps, and the smell of rubber bands and paper clips, and the smell of the oil stuff that they put on the floor, and the smell of waste paper. You know what waste paper smells like just before it's going to be swept up, when the guys throw all this stuff that they throw on the floor, all this sawdust with the oil, and it's got that smell. It's not a bad smell. It's the waste paper smell. It's kind of the school hall smell. You know what that smell is? kind of an oily, papery, inky, rubbery smell. And it's a very good smell. It's a warm smell. It's a smell to most people which spells one wonderful thing. It spells security, warmth. It does. And it also, for many men, I might point out, it spells peace. It spells order. And it spells love. To many women, it spells their world, their life. Well, I just began to understand that through this little incident that occurred. There was a woman who was a middle-aged woman. And, of course, I don't know. I was a kid. She might have been 9 years old. But she seemed middle-aged to me. But she really was. She was in her I would guess now about her middle 40s. Now, yeah, I think that's about what she was. And I remember her name. Her name was Kate. And Kate worked at the office. And she was one of these efficient women who, when I would come down there, of course, I didn't know about her being efficient. I just knew she was important. And I was a kid, and I would come down, and she would be behind the cage there. And all the people would be walking past, checking in and turning in the books and turning in the strips, and she'd be hitting this little machine, and she was working the comptometer, and everybody would be talking to her, and she had pencils stuck in her hair and rimless glasses, and she was really part of this whole scene. Well, you don't expect, you do expect, and yet you don't, to see these people out of that context. Well, once in a while, Kate would come over to our house for dinner, and she was an unmarried lady of an uncertain age. She was a maiden lady. They didn't call them that. She was just not married, that's all. She was a middle-aged lady who wasn't married. And she had this flat. And she had this mother that she was always writing to in St. Louis. Well, Kate would come around once in a while, and she was always with this man named George. Well, now, the one thing they used to say about George was that George drank. Now, I never saw him drink, but that's what they always said. They'd be like, George drinks, And Kate had been going with George for years. This I knew. And George had been an ex-boss of hers. He worked at some other place where she had worked. And she was always going with George. And she was always going to marry George. She and George were always on the verge for years. And they were always talking about furniture. And they were discussing where they were going to live and stuff. And so when they would come over to our house to have dinner, we would sit around, we would eat, and everyone would talk about George and Kate, just sort of like they were married, George and Kate. And George would talk about when they were going to get married, and Kate would talk about when they would get married, and everybody would talk just like they were married people, And I'm just this little kid. I'm sitting there eating away there, and George and Kate became an entity. You know how couples become entities? Like Fred and Ruthie? Like Mert and Marge or something? It was George and Kate. Well, Kate was always down at the office, and that led kind of an extra thing of glamour around it. She was a fairy, because she and my father, you see, could talk that special language. And they would sit there at the table and they would laugh about stuff about Clarence. You know, Clarence the other day when they were turning in the inventory books on the number 7 stock. Crying out loud. Clarence the other day, and they had this special talk which meant nothing to any rest of us, but it seemed very glamorous and very special and very exciting. Well, so George and Kate would come around. Well, one night after George and Kate left, I'm sitting there, and my father's sitting there, my kid brother's sitting there, and the lady from across the street was sitting there, Mrs. Stryker, who was a thin, angry lady who kind of looked like a sick parakeet. Mrs. Stryker looked, the parakeets, they sort of hold their heads down, and this is the way Mrs. Stryker was. Well, Mrs. Stryker was married to a tough guy who operated a truck, and she had 3 tough kids who at the age of 7 were already tough guys. They were beer drinkers before they even heard of beer. I mean, these kids didn't even know about beer, but they were already, that kind. So Mrs. Stryker is sitting there, and there was a kind of a relationship. Everyone knew everybody else, and there wasn't any jazz going on. And Mrs. Stryker said, I wonder when George and Kate are going to get married. Well, nobody ever approached it that bluntly, you see. She said, I wonder when George and Kate are going to get married. Well, there was a little moment there for regrouping. And I'm sitting there, I'm a kid, as they used to say, there are little ears. I can remember my mother always saying, be careful. Some ears in this room are bigger than cabbages. Meaning, shut up, the kids here. Well, I'm sitting there and my ears are bigger. Boy, you talk about cabbages, they're going, see? Because anytime you talked about men and women and stuff like that, I was ready. So, oh yeah, there was all kinds of mysterious stuff went on between men and women. So I'm sitting there and I'm listening, and she says, when are they going to get married? You wonder. Well, my mother says they're not going to. And, of course, this astounded me because I had been hearing this talk, and Kate was always talking about George, and George is always talking about Kate. My mother says they're not going to. Well, Mrs. Stryker says, well, what do you mean? Always talking about it. My father kept his mouth shut. He worked at the office. He knew. So she says, what do you mean? My mother says, well, you see, Kate doesn't want to. And that really got Mrs. Stryker going. What do you mean doesn't want to? Why, every woman wants to. My mother says, oh, no. She doesn't want to. And the reason she goes with George is that she knows that George is not about to marry anybody. Especially since George has a wife and 3 kids. Boy, I'm sitting there, my eyes are bulging and my ears are getting wider and wider. And she says, you see, Kate just doesn't want to get married, that's all. She's afraid of it. And furthermore, she hates men because of it. But yet she knows that she should be talking about being married, and she wants to be married on one end of the scale, and on the important end of the scale she doesn't. And so then they started to drink coffee, and that's all I heard about it. Well, now that stuck in my mind, and from the time that was said, and Kate and George would come around, I would look. It was very different then. It was so different. They kept talking about being married. They kept talking about it. They kept talking about the furniture. But me, being a kid, I'm listening now with a very different set of values. And my mother kept talking very politely about it. She was playing the game. I didn't realize that it was part of the game. This is the adult game. That she is pretending, and my father is pretending, and everybody else is pretending. But I'm a kid, see? Well, the head had to finally pop. It's just like something festering, It finally had to happen. So one day they're over there, and it was a beautiful summer day, and it just came right out of me. I said in a very loud, clear voice, and I remember distinctly saying it, I said to Kate, I said, Mrs. Kate, if somehow they always had me calling her Mrs. Kate or Aunt Kate or something like that. I said, Aunt Kate, my mother says you don't want to get married to George. And I didn't, I just thought it was a thing that she would want to talk about. Well, my mother just says, oh, he's kidding. He's just kidding. What do you mean, Jeannie? When did I say that? I said, well, don't you remember the day Mrs. Stryker was over here? And she says, now, what are you talking about? What are you out of your head? And Kate just sat there, and George didn't say anything. He crossed his legs about 4 times in opposite directions until finally he had them tied in a bow knot. And I says, don't you remember? You said that the reason that she didn't want to get married was it because she was scared of it, and because George wasn't going to marry her anyway, and that's why she liked going with George, because she knew that George would never make her get married, and George didn't want to get married because he's married and got 3 kids. Don't you remember? Well, I don't have to tell you the rest of the story, except to say that George and Kate never came to our house again. And I remember after they left that day, they left very early. My mother didn't know what to say to me. I didn't know it at the time, but all I knew was that there was a very peculiar atmosphere hanging around the house. And everyone sort of laughed about all this and says, oh, he's just a little kid. He's just making the funnies there. And after it was over, my mother just looked at me and said, you shouldn't have said that. And I said, how come, Ma? And she said, well, someday you'll understand. It's one of the very few times that I remember having been told, someday you'll understand. And now, I do. It's very spooky. And I have been observing this phenomenon ever since the age of 7. And I have come to realize that in this town, particularly in New York, there must be 50,000 women who are of uncertain age, who are vaguely in love with their boss, and who probably even at one time had a little thing going with them. And they're living out their world in this little apartment someplace where they grow plants and have cats, and they read mystery stories, and they knit, and they go to the theater on Thursday nights, and once in a while they will take a vacation trip to Nassau with some other woman, and they're vaguely in love with the boss. Not vaguely, really, totally and completely, but very covertly. And the boss himself, of course, loves it. He's perfectly aware of it. And every day when he comes into the office, his stomach feels hard. And he has for that brief moment when he comes in and that moment when he leaves, he has a sense of genuine power over somebody in the very real sense. Not the kind of power that comes from writing memos and hanging them on the bulletin board, but real power over someone's emotional life. And he feels good. He feels big and important. And as a matter of fact, there are probably 50,000 men in this town who are deadly afraid of their wives finding out the real story about the girl at the office or the woman at the office. And on the other hand, you see, he knows she never will because she doesn't want to know either. And so the game gets bigger and bigger and more complicated and more convoluted and more deeply ingrained into our subconsciousness until finally we don't even know it's a game any longer. That Kate really does believe she wants to marry George. And George really does believe he wants to marry Kate. And yet, in the very important, that dark little scurrying thing underneath the liver where the decisions are made, it will never be done. Because Kate has been systematically shunting off men who really did want to marry her all of her life. The first thing that she throws aside is a man when she finds that he really does want to do it. And then she says, I couldn't stand him. That's that silly fool, Brother Flowers, all that idiotic stuff. Okay? Oh, what a nut. What a silly idiot. Somehow, these men who want her don't excite her. The only persons who really do excite her are the men who do not want her. And this is the most exciting thing of all. And so this population of these people is growing by leaps and bounds, to use a wonderful old Midwestern cliche. You can just see it leaping and bounding down the highway there. But it is growing. And as our offices become more and more abstract with less and less actual responsibility, where the men who come into these offices make no decisions really. The decisions are made by outside polling organizations, the actual decisions. The suggestions come from the sales management concern, which is hired by an outside organization to just make suggestions to the men inside, until finally nobody has any responsibility. And yet there is a terrible desire for it, an awful desire for it. And so this growing involvement with the people around you, where the woman of uncertain age, every morning when the man walks in and he finds that she has laid out for him the hot cup of coffee, she has laid out for him his pencils, and she has opened his mail, he feels, suddenly he feels that leonine heart, that great stalking feral beast, that beast that lurks in the jungle with long claws and thin white teeth. And for that moment his eyes are shining and glistening, looking out of that primeval forest of the carnivore. Oh, I'm important, and I'm dangerous. Life and death I control with that woman. And she goes back to her machine and sits. The sound of her stays squeaking slightly. Her doily over there on the air conditioning machine vibrating quietly. Her fresh geranium plant nicely watered. And the game goes on and on and on. On and on and on. Just never mention it. Just never mention it.
That's it for Air Checks this week. We will have more Gene Shepherd next week. I can't always tell how long each episode is going to be, but we keep on doing this until we hit the last episode in 1977. Air Checks is normally a 3-hour podcast uploaded weekly and can be heard every Sunday on the K-Tai radio network. See you at the same time and same channel.